Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There is something about violence that most people misunderstand. They imagine it arrives suddenly, like a storm that tears through a quiet afternoon without warning. They picture screaming, chaos, the unmistakable signs that something has gone terribly wrong. But that is not how most violence works. Most violence is quiet. It builds in the spaces between words, in the silences that stretch too long, in the explanations that sound reasonable until years later when you realize they never made sense at all. Most violence hides in plain sight, wearing the face of normalcy, and the worst part is that we help it hide. We accept the excuses. We fill in the gaps with our own hopeful narratives. We choose to believe because disbelief requires action, and action requires us to admit that we might have been wrong about someone we thought we knew. This is not a story about monsters. Monsters are easy to identify, easy to fear, easy to guard against. This is a story about people who seemed ordinary, about systems that promised protection but delivered only paperwork, about the small moments when someone could have asked one more question but didn't. It is about absence, the kind that goes unnoticed because we are all so busy, so distracted, so willing to accept that people sometimes just drift away. It is about the lies we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, the ones that sound like kindness but function as neglect. Over the next few hours, you will hear 5 stories. They happened in different places, to different people, under different circumstances. But they share something essential. They are all about the moment when someone should have been seen, should have been heard, should have been saved, and wasn't. They are about the gap between what happened and what anyone knew was happening. They are about time moving forward when it should have stopped, about questions that were never asked, about the terrible weight of discovering the truth too late to matter. These stories will not rush. There will be no dramatic music, no shocking revelations designed to jolt you awake. Instead, they will unfold the way these events actually unfolded, slowly, quietly, with a creeping sense that something is wrong but no clear evidence to prove it. You will feel the same uncertainty that the people in these stories felt. You will understand why they made the choices they made, why they believed what they believed, why they waited when they should have acted. And you will realize, perhaps uncomfortably, that you might have done the same thing. The first story begins in a place that feels far from danger, in the kind of rural landscape where people know their neighbors, where children play outside until dark, where the pace of life moves slowly enough that everyone notices everything, or so they believe. It begins with a man who loved the sky, who spent his evenings in a hangar surrounded by the smell of engine oil and aviation fuel, who talked about flying the way other men talk about freedom. His name was Ethan Holloway, and for a long time, no one realized he was gone. Ethan had worked at the same small airport for 15 years, maintaining the single-engine planes that local farmers and businessmen used to avoid the long drives between towns. He was good at his work, meticulous in a way that made pilots trust him with their lives. He had steady hands and a quiet manner, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who solved problems without needing credit for the solution. People liked him. More importantly, people relied on him, which in a small community is a deeper form of respect. He had married Marla when they were both young, before either of them fully understood what they were choosing. She had been beautiful in a sharp, angular way, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to assess everyone she met. In the early years, that intensity had felt like passion. Ethan had loved the way she seemed to see through pretense, the way she demanded honesty even when it hurt. But somewhere in the middle years of their marriage, after their 2 children were born, after the routines of work and school and bills had worn the shine off everything, that same intensity began to feel different. It felt like scrutiny. It felt like judgment. It felt, though Ethan would never have used this word, like surveillance. Their house sat on 3 acres of pine land outside Redwood Falls, far enough from town that neighbors were a concept more than a reality. Marla had wanted space, had talked about gardening and chickens, and teaching the children to be self-sufficient. But the garden had never materialized beyond a few tomato plants that died every August, and the chickens had been sold after one winter because Marla said the smell bothered her. The space, it turned out, was not for building something. It was for keeping distance. Ethan spent more and more time at the hangar. He told himself it was because the work demanded it, because pilots needed their planes ready at unpredictable hours, because mechanical problems did not respect schedules. And all of that was true. But it was also true that the hangar was the only place where he felt competent, where his presence was wanted rather than tolerated, where silence was comfortable instead of accusatory. Marla never complained about his hours. That should have been a relief, but somehow it made him uneasy. She would smile when he came home late, ask if he wanted dinner reheated, mention some small household task that needed attention. Her tone was always pleasant, always reasonable, but there was something underneath it that Ethan could not name. It was as if she were playing a role, and playing it well, but he could sense the effort it required. Their fights, when they happened, were never loud. Marla did not yell. She became very still instead, very focused, and she would ask questions that sounded like concern but felt like cross-examination. Where had he been? Who had he talked to? Why had it taken 3 hours to replace a fuel pump that should have taken 90 minutes? Ethan would answer truthfully because he had nothing to hide, but his truthfulness never seemed to satisfy her. She would nod, say she understood, and then hours or days later she would refer back to some detail of his answer in a way that suggested she had been testing him, checking his story for inconsistencies that did not exist. The children noticed, though they were too young to articulate what they were noticing. Emma, the oldest at 12, became very quiet around her mother, very careful. She learned to anticipate Marla's moods, to adjust her behavior preemptively, to make herself small and unobtrusive. Nathan, who was 9, developed a habit of asking his father the same question multiple times, as if he could not quite trust that the answer would remain stable. Ethan saw these things and felt a guilt that had no clear object. He was not doing anything wrong, but something was wrong, and he did not know how to fix it. Money was tight, but money was always tight. Ethan made a decent wage, but decent did not stretch far with 2 children and a mortgage and Marla's insistence on certain standards that seemed to require constant spending. She bought things for the house, decorative items that sat and used, kitchen gadgets that never left their boxes, clothing for the children that they outgrew before wearing. When Ethan mentioned the credit card balance, Marla would agree that they needed to be more careful, and then the packages would keep arriving. He thought about leaving. Not often, and never seriously, but the thought was there. He would imagine himself in a small apartment in town, seeing the children on weekends, starting over with the kind of simplicity that seemed impossible within a marriage. But he could not picture actually doing it. He could not imagine the conversation, could not imagine Marla's reaction, could not imagine being the kind of man who walked away from his family. So he stayed, and the days continued, and he told himself that this was just what marriage was, that everyone felt this kind of quiet dissatisfaction, that the alternative would be worse. And then one day, Ethan Holloway did not come home from work. It was a Thursday in October, the kind of crisp autumn day when the light turns golden in the late afternoon and the air smells like wood smoke and distant rain. Ethan had left for the hangar at 7 in the morning, same as always. He had kissed Marla on the cheek, a gesture so automatic that neither of them thought about it. He had told the children to have a good day at school. He had driven his truck down the long gravel driveway, and that was the last time anyone saw him. Except that is not quite true, because people did see Ethan, or at least they thought they did. His truck was spotted in town that afternoon. A colleague at the hangar said they had talked about a carburetor problem around 2 o'clock. A waitress at the diner remembered serving him coffee, though when pressed she could not recall if it had been that Thursday or the Thursday before. Memory is unreliable, especially when no one knows they are supposed to be remembering, when there is no reason to mark the day as significant. Marla did not call the police when Ethan failed to come home that night. She told the children that their father was working late, which was not unusual. She put them to bed at the regular time, read them their stories, turned out the lights. She cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, went through the motions of an ordinary evening. When Emma asked the next morning where Dad was, Marla said he had needed to help a pilot with an emergency repair and had decided to sleep at the hangar rather than drive home exhausted. It was a reasonable explanation. It had happened before. By the weekend, the explanation had shifted slightly. Ethan had gone to visit a friend, Marla said. He needed some time to clear his head, to think about some things. She said it calmly, as if this were a normal occurrence. as if married men regularly disappeared without warning to clear their heads. Emma looked uncertain, but said nothing. Nathan asked when Dad would be back, and Marla said soon. Probably soon. There was nothing to worry about. On Monday, a text message arrived on Marla's phone from Ethan's number. It said he was fine, that he needed space, that he would be in touch. The message was brief and strange, lacking Ethan's usual tone, but it was there, evidence that he was alive and communicating. Marla showed it to a neighbor who had asked if everything was all right. The neighbor said, "Well, that's good. At least you know he's okay." And Marla agreed. Yes, at least there was that. More messages came over the following weeks. Short, infrequent, always vague. Marla shared some of them with friends. Proof that Ethan was out there somewhere, working through whatever crisis had driven him away. People stopped asking as many questions. They had evidence now, digital breadcrumbs that suggested a man taking time for himself, perhaps selfishly, perhaps irresponsibly, but not a man in danger. The concern shifted from where is Ethan to what is wrong with Ethan, and then, inevitably, to poor Marla, having to deal with this. She handled it gracefully. That was what people said. She kept the household running, got the children to school, maintained her composure. She seemed hurt, but not devastated, confused, but not frantic. She projected exactly the right amount of dignified uncertainty, enough to earn sympathy, but not so much as to suggest anything truly alarming. When people offered to help, she thanked them, but said she was managing. When people asked if she had contacted the police, she said Ethan was an adult. He was communicating. There was nothing the police could do about a man who chose to leave. And technically, she was right. The weeks became months, and the months revealed a pattern that should have seemed impossible, but somehow did not. Financial activity continued in Ethan's name. His bank account showed regular small withdrawals, the kind a person might make if they were living somewhere modestly, moving through the world without drawing attention. His credit card was used occasionally, for gas stations and grocery stores, never in the same location twice. Always in towns far enough away that no one could pinpoint where he might be staying. The pattern suggested a man drifting, unsettled, avoiding commitment to any particular place. Marla handled the finances. She had always been the one who paid the bills, who balanced the accounts, who understood the complicated dance of due dates and minimum payments. Now she explained to the bank that her husband was going through something, that she needed access to manage things while he was away. She produced the text messages as evidence that he was alive and aware, that this was a temporary separation, not an abandonment. The bank noted the situation and allowed her to continue managing their joint accounts. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything proceeded according to the rules. The children asked about their father less frequently as time passed. Children are adaptable in ways that can seem either miraculous or tragic depending on your perspective. They learn to accept new realities, to stop asking questions that produce only vague answers, to reorganize their understanding of the world around whatever new shape it has taken. Emma threw herself into schoolwork, becoming the kind of student who never missed an assignment, who sought approval from teachers with an intensity that suggested she was trying to earn something that had nothing to do with grades. Nathan became quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in his room building elaborate structures from blocks, and then destroying them, over and over, in a ritual that seemed to satisfy something he could not articulate. Marla told them their father still loved them, that he was just confused right now, that adults sometimes needed time to figure things out. She said it with enough conviction that the children wanted to believe her, even as some part of them understood that the explanation did not quite make sense. A father who loved them would call, would visit, would send more than occasional brief text messages that read like grocery lists. But children learn early that adults are allowed to contradict themselves, that the world of grown-up emotions operates according to rules that have not been explained to them, and so they adjusted. Holidays arrived and passed with Ethan's absence becoming normalized. Thanksgiving dinner was just the three of them, and Marla cooked all of Ethan's favorite dishes as if he might walk through the door at any moment, as if his absence were a choice he could reverse with a simple decision. Christmas was harder. Emma cried. Finally, when there were no presents from her father under the tree, and Marla held her and said that he had sent money for gifts instead, that he was thinking of them even if he could not be there. It was unclear whether Emma believed this, but she stopped crying, which was all that mattered in the moment. Friends and neighbors had stopped bringing up Ethan's disappearance by the new year. It had become old news, a situation that was simply part of Marla's life now, like a chronic illness or a difficult financial situation. People expressed sympathy when they saw her, but no longer asked for updates. The story had been told, the explanations had been given, and there was nothing new to say. Ethan had left. Ethan was somewhere out there. Ethan was managing his own life in whatever way he had chosen. It was sad, certainly, but it was also his choice, and adults were allowed to make choices, even destructive ones. The colleague who had worked with Ethan at the hangar thought about calling the police a few times during that first year. Something about the situation bothered him, though he could not articulate what. Ethan had not seemed like the kind of man who would abandon his family. He had talked about his children constantly, had kept photos of them taped inside his toolbox, had adjusted his schedule whenever they had school events. The colleague mentioned his concerns to his wife, who said that you never really know what goes on inside a marriage, that people surprise you, that maybe Ethan had been unhappy for years and had finally reached his breaking point. The colleague accepted this because it was easier than the alternative, which was believing that something terrible had happened and that he had missed the signs. By the second year, Marla had settled into her new life with a competence that impressed everyone who knew her. She had taken a part-time job at a medical office, answering phones and filing insurance claims, work that was boring but stable. She managed the household budget with careful precision, making sure the bills were paid, the children were fed, the mortgage stayed current. She even began dating, cautiously, meeting men through a church singles group and going on occasional dinners that she described to friends as nice, but nothing serious. She was moving forward, people said. She was not letting Ethan's abandonment destroy her. She was strong. The children were doing well enough, all things considered. Emma had entered high school and joined the debate team, channeling whatever she felt into structured argument and research. Nathan had discovered art, spending hours drawing detailed pictures of imaginary cities, places where buildings grew like trees and streets curved in impossible spirals. A school counselor had suggested therapy, concerned about the prolonged absence of their father, but Marla had declined, saying the children were resilient, that they were coping in their own ways, that therapy might make them focus on the loss rather than moving past it. The counselor had not pushed the issue. Parents had rights. The children seemed functional. There was no evidence of abuse or neglect. And then, in the spring of the third year, Marla announced that she wanted to make some improvements to the house. The backyard, she said, had always been underutilized. She wanted to create a proper patio area, a place where the family could gather, where she could host barbecues in the summer. She hired a contractor, a man who had done work for several families in the area and came recommended. She showed him exactly where she wanted the concrete poured, a large rectangular area near the back of the property, bordered by pine trees on three sides. The contractor said it was a good location, level ground, good drainage. It would make a nice outdoor space. The work took 2 weeks. The contractor and his crew dug out the area, laid gravel for the foundation, built wooden forms to hold the shape, and poured the concrete in sections to ensure it cured evenly. Marla watched the process with close attention, bringing the workers lemonade on hot days, asking questions about the mixture and the thickness and the finishing techniques. The contractor thought she was unusually interested in the details for a client, but some people were like that, wanted to understand every aspect of a project, and there was nothing wrong with that. When the work was finished, Marla paid in cash, which the contractor noted but did not question. Cash was always welcome, even if it was slightly unusual for a project of that size. The patio looked good. Marla bought outdoor furniture, a table and chairs, a grill. She hosted a small gathering that summer, inviting neighbors over for hamburgers and conversation. People complimented the new space, said how nice it was, how it really opened up the yard. Marla smiled and thanked them and said it had been something she had wanted to do for a long time, a way to make the house feel more like a home now that it was just her and the children. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? It was just a patio. Years 4 and 5 passed with an eerie stability. Ethan's text messages had stopped arriving, but by that point no one expected them anymore. Marla told people that she had finally accepted that he was not coming back, that she had filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment, that she was ready to move on with her life. The divorce was granted without Ethan's presence, a legal acknowledgement that a marriage had ended when one party refused to participate in its continuation. Marla kept the house, kept custody of the children, kept everything because there was no one to contest her claims. Emma graduated from high school near the top of her class and left for college on the other side of the state. She called her mother dutifully once a week, but the conversations were brief, functional, focused on logistics rather than emotions. She never asked about her father anymore. That part of her life had been sealed off, boxed away in whatever mental compartment people use for grief that has no clear resolution. Nathan was still in high school, still drawing, still quiet, still carrying something that he could not name, but that shaped the way he moved through the world. The anonymous tip came on a Tuesday morning in October, almost 6 years to the day after Ethan had disappeared. It was called into the police department from a prepaid cell phone, a voice that was muffled and distorted but clear enough to understand. The caller said that Ethan Holloway had not left. The caller said that Marla Holloway knew exactly where her husband was. The caller said they should look under the patio. The detective who took the call was skeptical. Anonymous tips were common, and most of them led nowhere, the product of feuds or mental illness or boredom. But something about this one felt different. The caller had not been hysterical or vague. They had been specific, calm, almost reluctant, as if they had been carrying the information for a long time and had finally decided they could not carry it anymore. The detective pulled up the file on Ethan Holloway, which was thin, barely a file at all. Man leaves family, sends messages, no indication of foul play, case inactive. But there had been a case, which meant someone had reported him missing at some point, even if it had gone nowhere. The detective drove out to the house that afternoon, not with a warrant or a team, just a preliminary visit to ask some questions. Marla answered the door looking composed and unsurprised, as if she had been expecting this conversation for years. She invited him in, offered coffee, sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her like a person prepared for an interview. The detective explained that they had received a tip, that it was probably nothing, but they needed to follow up. He asked if she would mind if they examined the patio area, just to eliminate the possibility, just to close the loop on the investigation. Marla said no. She said it quietly, without emotion, but very clearly. She said that her husband had abandoned her and her children 6 years ago, that she had rebuilt her life, that she was not going to allow baseless accusations to destroy the stability she had created. She said that if the police wanted to dig up her property, they would need a warrant. She said this with the confidence of someone who had thought through every possible scenario, who had prepared for this moment, who understood exactly what rights she had and how far those rights extended. The detective left, but he also applied for the warrant. The tip had been too specific to ignore, and Marla's refusal, while legally sound, had a quality that bothered him. An innocent person might have been angry or offended, might have demanded to know who had made such an accusation, might have insisted that the police search immediately just to prove the absurdity of the claim. Marla had done none of those things. She had simply said no, as if she were protecting something, as if she knew that once the digging started, there would be no way to stop what came next. The warrant was granted 3 days later. A judge reviewed the anonymous tip, the case history, and Marla's refusal to cooperate, and decided that there was sufficient cause to investigate. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in first, a precaution to avoid unnecessary destruction of property if the tip proved baseless. The technician moved the equipment slowly across the patio, watching the screen for anomalies in the subsurface, for patterns that might indicate disturbed soil or foreign objects beneath the concrete. When the scan was complete, he showed the detective the images. There was something there. Something large, roughly 6 feet long, buried at a depth that corresponded exactly to where a foundation would have been prepared before the concrete was poured. The excavation began on a gray morning in late October, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and colorless and the air carries the smell of decay from the surrounding woods. Marla was not arrested, not yet, but she was asked to stay inside the house while the work proceeded. She sat in the living room with the curtains drawn, drinking coffee, not looking toward the windows, not reacting to the sounds of jackhammers and shovels that echoed across the yard. Nathan was at school. Emma had been called and told to stay at college, that there was a situation, that she would be contacted when there was more information. She had asked what kind of situation and had been told that her mother was fine, that no one was in danger, that it was just a police matter. She had not asked about her father. Some part of her already knew. It took 6 hours to break through the concrete and remove enough material to reach what lay beneath. The workers moved carefully, methodically, aware that they were excavating what might be a crime scene, that every action had to be documented, that mistakes could compromise whatever evidence remained. The body was wrapped in plastic sheeting, heavy-duty construction material, the kind that was used to protect lumber from moisture. It had been placed in the shallow grave before the gravel was laid, before the concrete was poured, embedded in the very structure of the patio, so that it became part of the foundation, invisible, permanent, forgotten. Identification would require dental records and DNA analysis, but no one doubted who it was. The build was right. The clothing suggested a man who worked with his hands, and there was a wedding ring on the left hand, a simple gold band that Marla had bought for Ethan 20 years earlier in a small jewelry shop in town. The medical examiner would later determine that death had occurred from blunt force trauma to the head, multiple impacts, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The injuries suggested rage, or panic, or both, a sustained attack that had continued well past the point of necessity. Ethan Holloway had not died quickly. He had died badly. Marla was arrested that evening and charged with first-degree murder. She did not resist, did not protest, did not ask for a lawyer until she was already in the interrogation room with detectives who had spent the afternoon reconstructing what they believed had happened. They theorized that there had been an argument, that Ethan had perhaps threatened to leave or to take the children, that Marla had struck him in a moment of rage and then, realizing what she had done, had made the calculated decision to hide the body and construct an elaborate fiction to explain his absence. The text messages had been sent from his phone, which Marla had kept and used sparingly to maintain the illusion that he was alive. The financial activity had been managed through online banking, small withdrawals that looked like the actions of a person living modestly, but that were actually just Marla moving money around to create a pattern. The entire structure of Ethan's absence had been a performance, maintained for 6 years with remarkable discipline. When asked why she had built the patio over the grave, Marla had said nothing. Her lawyer, a public defender who looked exhausted before the case even began, advised her to remain silent, and she did. But the answer seemed obvious to the investigators. She had wanted to make the burial permanent, to encase it in concrete, so that no casual digging or erosion would ever expose what lay beneath. And perhaps, on some level, she had wanted to stand on it, to walk across it every day, to host gatherings on top of it, to prove to herself that she could bear the weight of what she had done without breaking. The trial took place the following spring. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the timeline, the testimony of experts who explained how the text messages had been fabricated and the financial activity had been manipulated. They called witnesses who described Marla's composure during the years of Ethan's absence, the way she had seemed not devastated but relieved, the way she had moved forward without the hesitation that grief usually demands. They argued that this was not a crime of passion but a crime of control, that Marla had killed her husband not in a moment of rage but as a solution to a problem, and that she had then spent 6 years living a lie with such commitment that no one had questioned it. The defense had little to work with. They could not deny that Ethan was dead, that he was buried under the patio, that Marla had known this all along. They could not explain away the text messages or the financial manipulation. What they tried to argue instead was context, the idea that Marla had been living in a state of fear, that Ethan had been controlling and abusive, that the marriage had been a prison and Marla had finally, desperately, fought back. They called no witnesses to support this version of events because there were none. Ethan's colleagues described him as gentle, patient, the kind of man who solved problems quietly. His friends said he had never spoken ill of his wife, had never complained about his marriage beyond the vague dissatisfactions that everyone experiences. The defense's narrative was a construction built on nothing, and the jury saw through it. Marla was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read, no reaction when the judge pronounced the sentence. She simply stood, allowed herself to be handcuffed, and walked out of the courtroom with the same measured composure she had maintained throughout the trial. The only moment when her control slipped was when she glanced toward the gallery and saw Emma sitting in the back row, watching with an expression that held no love, no anger, no grief, only a kind of exhausted recognition. Their eyes met for less than a second before Marla looked away, and that was the last time Emma saw her mother as a free woman. Nathan did not attend the trial. He had been placed with a foster family when Marla was arrested, a couple in the next county who were kind but overwhelmed by the complexity of his situation. He stopped drawing for almost a year after his mother's conviction, stopped creating the imaginary cities that had been his escape. When he finally picked up a pencil again, the cities he drew were different, darker, full of empty buildings and streets that led nowhere. A therapist tried to help him process what had happened. But how do you process the knowledge that your mother killed your father, buried him in the backyard, and then cooked dinner and helped with homework and attended parent-teacher conferences for 6 years while standing on top of his grave? There is no framework for that kind of betrayal. There are no words that make it smaller or more manageable. Emma finished college and moved to a city on the opposite coast, as far from Redwood Falls as geography would allow. She changed her last name legally, shedding Holloway like a skin that no longer fit, taking her grandmother's maiden name instead. She rarely spoke about her childhood, and when she did, it was in vague terms, a difficult family situation, a complicated past, nothing she wanted to discuss. She built a life that was aggressively normal, a job in marketing, a small apartment, a few close friends who knew better than to ask too many questions. But she carried the knowledge everywhere, the understanding that the entire foundation of her childhood had been a lie, that every memory was contaminated by the truth of what her mother had done. The question that haunted everyone who learned about the case was simple and impossible. How had no one known? How had Marla maintained the fiction for so long without anyone seeing through it? The answer was uncomfortable because it implicated everyone. People had chosen to believe her because disbelief was inconvenient, because it would have required them to do something, to get involved, to question a grieving woman's story. The text messages had been enough because people wanted them to be enough. The financial activity had been enough because people wanted it to be enough. Ethan's absence had become acceptable because people had accepted it, and once a community accepts something, it becomes very difficult to unaccept it, to admit that everyone had been wrong, that everyone had failed. The colleague from the hangar quit his job 6 months after the trial. He could not stand walking past Ethan's old workstation, could not stop thinking about all the times he had almost called the police, almost pushed harder, almost done something other than accept the easy explanation. He moved to another state and took a job doing something completely different, as if putting physical distance between himself and the hangar could somehow absolve him of the guilt he carried. It could not. Guilt does not work that way. It follows. The neighbor who had seen the text message early on and said, "Well, at least you know he's okay," she stopped sleeping well. She would lie awake thinking about that moment, about how quickly she had accepted Marla's explanation, about how she had participated in normalizing the abnormal. She had been trying to be kind, trying to offer comfort, trying to be a good neighbor. But her kindness had functioned as permission, had helped Marla maintain the lie for another day, another week, another year. She understood now that kindness without questions is not always kindness. Sometimes it is just cowardice dressed up as compassion. Redwood Falls itself seemed to shrink after the trial, as if the revelation had drained something essential from the community. People moved away. Property values dropped. The small airport where Ethan had worked eventually closed, not because of the murder directly, but because the murder had been a symptom of something larger, a demonstration that the town was not what people had believed it was, that safety was an illusion, that terrible things could happen anywhere, even here, even in full view of everyone, and no one would notice until it was far too late. The house remained empty for 3 years before it was finally sold at auction. No one wanted to live in the place where Ethan Holloway had died, where his body had been buried, where his children had eaten breakfast and done homework and celebrated birthdays while their father decomposed beneath the backyard patio. Eventually, a developer bought it, tore down the structure, and subdivided the land into smaller lots. New houses were built, occupied by people who did not know the history, who had no reason to wonder about what had happened there. The past was paved over, literally, and life continued because that is what life does. It continues, indifferent to memory, indifferent to justice, indifferent to the people who are no longer there to witness it. But Ethan's story, Marla's story, The story of those 6 years of accepted absence. It did not disappear. It lingered in the way that true crime stories linger, passed around in online forums and podcast episodes and conversations between strangers who were trying to understand how such a thing could happen. People wanted explanations, wanted to believe that there had been clear signs, that Marla had made mistakes, that someone should have known. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Marla had not made mistakes. She had understood exactly how people work, how communities function, how much you can get away with if you are patient and calm and willing to perform normalcy for as long as necessary. The story of Ethan and Marla Holloway is not about one woman's capacity for violence. It is about the space that violence needs in order to survive, the silence and distance and willful blindness that allow it to continue. It is about the terrible truth that most crimes are solved not through brilliant detective work, but through someone finally deciding to pay attention, to ask the question that everyone else had avoided, to refuse the easy explanation. And sometimes, by the time someone does that, it is already far too late. What follows is a different kind of story, but it shares the same essential architecture. It is about control that looked like love, about isolation that felt like protection, about violence that built so slowly that no one recognized it as violence until the moment it became irreversible. It is about a woman who came to this country with hope, who trusted the wrong person, who discovered that the people she thought would help her were not listening, were not looking, were not there. Lucia Moreno arrived in Mesa Verde in the summer with 2 suitcases and a tourist visa that would expire in 90 days. She was 26 years old, and she had been corresponding with Daniel Reyes for almost a year, long messages exchanged through an international dating site, conversations that had progressed from casual interest to something that felt like love, or at least like the promise of love. Daniel had been patient, attentive, asking about her life in Guadalajara, her family, her dreams. He had told her about his work as a construction foreman, about the house he owned in the desert suburbs, about how lonely he was, how ready he was to build a life with someone. When he asked her to visit, to see if what they had online could translate into something real, Lucia had said yes without hesitation. The relationship moved quickly once she arrived. Daniel met her at the airport with flowers, took her to his house, showed her the room he had prepared, separate from his own, respectful of boundaries. They spent the first week like tourists, visiting the nearby national park, eating at restaurants, talking late into the night about the future they might build together. Lucia felt safe with him, felt seen in a way she had not felt before. Daniel told her she was beautiful, that he had been waiting for someone like her his entire life, that he could not imagine letting her leave when her visa expired. When he asked her to marry him 3 weeks after her arrival, Lucia said yes. It felt fast, but everything in America felt fast, and Daniel made the speed seem romantic rather than reckless. They went to the courthouse, filled out the paperwork, had a brief ceremony with 2 strangers pulled in from the hallway to serve as witnesses. Lucia signed her new name, Lucia Reyes, and felt a combination of excitement and vertigo, the sense that her life had fundamentally changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The first few months of the marriage were good, or at least Lucia told herself they were good. Daniel was working long hours on a commercial project across town, which meant she was alone in the house most of the day, but that was fine. That was normal. That was what marriage to a working man looked like. She tried to make the house feel like a home, rearranging furniture, cooking elaborate meals that Daniel sometimes ate and sometimes ignored, teaching herself English from television programs and library books. She was lonely, but she had expected to be lonely at first, had expected that building a life in a new country would take time. Daniel's attention, so constant during their courtship, began to feel different once they were married. He wanted to know where she had been when he came home from work, wanted to see the receipts from any errands she had run, wanted explanations for phone calls or messages from her family back in Mexico. Lucia assumed this was cultural, some difference in how relationships worked here, or maybe just Daniel's personality, a man who liked order and transparency. She tried to be accommodating, tried to provide the information he wanted before he asked for it, tried to anticipate his needs so that he would not have reason to be upset. But he was upset anyway, more and more often, about things that seemed trivial to Lucia, but that Daniel treated as betrayals. She had bought the wrong brand of coffee. She had folded his shirts incorrectly. She had smiled too much at the cashier at the grocery store. The arguments were never loud, never physical, but they were relentless, and they always followed the same pattern. Daniel would express disappointment, would explain in calm, measured tones how Lucia had failed to meet his expectations, would suggest that maybe she did not really love him, maybe she was not really committed to the marriage, maybe she was just using him for a green card. And Lucia, desperate to prove that none of those things were true, would apologize, would promise to do better, would absorb his dissatisfaction as if it were her responsibility to fix. Her family called less frequently as the months passed. Daniel did not forbid the calls, but he made them difficult, asking why she needed to talk to her mother so often, suggesting that maybe she was homesick, that maybe she was not happy here, that maybe she should just go back to Mexico if she missed it so much. Lucia learned to keep the calls short, to wait until Daniel was at work, to never mention anything that might suggest she was unhappy because unhappiness would be used as evidence against her. She told her mother that everything was wonderful, that Daniel was wonderful, that she was building a beautiful life. Her mother, hearing the strain in her daughter's voice, asked if she was sure, if everything was really okay. Lucia said yes. What else could she say? Admitting that she had made a mistake would mean admitting that she had been foolish, that she had rushed into marriage with a stranger, that she was trapped in a country where she had no friends, no job, no legal status that did not depend on Daniel. The money was Daniel's. He made that clear early on. Lucia had no access to the bank accounts, no credit cards in her name, no income of her own. Daniel gave her an allowance for groceries and household supplies, and he reviewed every receipt, questioning any expense that seemed unnecessary. When Lucia suggested that she might get a job, that she could contribute financially, Daniel had laughed and asked what she thought she could do without legal work authorization, without fluent English, without any skills that translated to the American job market. He said it kindly, as if he were protecting her from disappointment, but the message was clear. She was dependent on him, and that dependence was not going to change. Lucia began to understand that the marriage was not what she had believed it would be. She was not a partner. She was a project, something Daniel was trying to shape into his ideal image of a wife, and every deviation from that image was treated as a failure. She tried to conform, tried to be exactly what he wanted, but the target kept moving. If she was quiet, he accused her of sulking. If she was cheerful, he said she was faking. If she cooked his favorite meal, he said it was too salty or too bland, or not what he had wanted that day. There was no way to win because winning was not the point. The point was control, the constant reinforcement of the power imbalance between them. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating these in-depth, true crime narratives. The isolation intensified during the second year of their marriage. Daniel decided they should move to a different house, further from town, a place where the neighbors were spread out over acres of desert scrub and no one could hear what happened behind closed doors. Lucia had no say in the decision. Daniel presented it as a financial opportunity, a bigger house for less money, a chance to have more space. She nodded and packed their belongings and tried not to think about how the new house felt like a cage, beautiful and spacious and utterly remote. The arguments grew worse in the new house. Or maybe they had always been this bad, and Lucia had simply stopped pretending they were normal. Daniel's anger, previously expressed through cold silence and disappointed lectures, began to manifest physically. He did not hit her, not at first, but he would grab her wrist when he was making a point, squeeze hard enough to leave marks that lasted for days. He would stand too close, use his size to intimidate, back her into corners where she could not escape without pushing past him. He called it passion, said that this was what real love looked like, that American women did not understand the intensity of true commitment. Lucia did not believe him, but she also did not know what to do with her disbelief. Leaving seemed impossible. Where would she go? How would she survive? She tried once to reach out for help. She had met a woman at the grocery store, another immigrant, someone who spoke Spanish and who had given Lucia her phone number, said to call if she ever needed anything. Lucia called from a pay phone while Daniel was at work, her hands shaking as she dialed, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that she needed help, that her marriage was not safe, that she did not know what to do. The woman had been kind but helpless. She suggested that Lucia call the police, but Lucia knew that was not an option. Her visa status depended on Daniel. If she reported him, if she left him, she would be deported, sent back to Mexico with nothing, a failure in the eyes of her family and herself. The woman had no other solutions to offer. She said she was sorry, said she would pray for Lucia, and that was where the conversation ended. The first time Daniel hit her, it was over something so small that Lucia could not even remember what it was later. Maybe she had forgotten to buy milk. Maybe she had said something he interpreted as disrespectful. Maybe there was no reason at all, and he had simply been angry about something else, and she had been there, available, a target for frustration that had no other outlet. He slapped her across the face, open-handed, not hard enough to knock her down but hard enough to shock her, to make her ears ring, to leave a red mark that faded over the next hour. Afterward, he cried. He apologized, said he did not know what had come over him, said he loved her so much that sometimes it overwhelmed him, made him crazy. He promised it would never happen again. It happened again 2 weeks later, and then a week after that, and then it stopped being an event and became a pattern, something that Lucia learned to navigate the way you navigate any dangerous terrain. She learned which topics to avoid, which expressions might trigger his anger, how to make herself smaller and quieter so that she would not draw his attention when he was in one of his moods. She learned to hide the bruises, to wear long sleeves even in the desert heat, to avoid eye contact with anyone who might ask questions. She learned to lie convincingly when Daniel's coworkers came over for dinner and asked how she was doing, to smile and say that everything was wonderful, that she loved her life here, that she was so grateful to Daniel for everything he had done for her. The neighbors, the few who lived close enough to matter, heard things occasionally. Raised voices, though never screaming. The sound of something breaking. Once, a loud thud followed by silence. But desert houses are far apart, and sound travels strangely in open space. And people are very good at convincing themselves that what they heard was not what they thought they heard. Maybe it was a television program. Maybe it was an argument, the normal kind that married couples have. Maybe it was none of their business. That last thought was the most persuasive. People do not want to get involved in domestic situations. They tell themselves that interfering would be inappropriate, that couples need to work things out on their own, that calling the police would be an overreaction. And so they hear, and they do nothing, and the violence continues. Lucia stopped calling her family entirely. She could not bear to lie anymore, could not maintain the fiction that her life was fine when every day was an exercise in survival. Her mother tried calling her, left messages that went unreturned, eventually stopped trying, because what else could she do from 2,000 miles away? Lucia's silence was interpreted as contentment, as being too busy with her new life to maintain old connections. No one imagined the truth, which was that Lucia was disappearing, not physically, but in every other way, becoming a ghost in her own life, a person whose needs and desires and even safety did not matter. Daniel's control extended to every aspect of her existence. He monitored her phone, read her messages, demanded passwords to any account she tried to create. He gave her less money for groceries, saying they needed to save, that she was being wasteful. Lucia lost weight, not because she was trying to, but because there was not enough food, and when Daniel noticed, he accused her of being vain, of starving herself to attract other men. There was no logic to his accusations, no consistency, only the constant application of pressure designed to keep her off balance, to make her doubt her own perceptions, to ensure that she never felt stable enough to plan an escape. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late autumn. Daniel had come home from work angry about something that had happened on the job site, some conflict with a subcontractor or a delayed shipment. Lucia was not sure because he did not explain, just started yelling the moment he walked through the door. She tried to calm him, tried to offer him food, tried to do everything she had learned to do in these situations. But tonight, nothing worked. He grabbed her by the hair, dragged her across the living room, threw her against the wall hard enough that her head bounced off the drywall and left a dent. She tasted blood in her mouth, felt the room spin, heard him saying things that did not form into coherent sentences, just rage expressed as sound. She does not remember the moment when she fought back, does not remember making the decision. Her body made it for her, some survival instinct overriding the fear that had kept her passive for so long. She scratched at his face, kicked at his legs, screamed in a way she had never screamed before, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than thought. Daniel, surprised by her resistance, loosened his grip for just a second, and that was enough. Lucia ran for the bathroom, locked herself inside, and called the police from the cell phone Daniel did not know she had, a prepaid phone she had bought months earlier and hidden in the back of a cabinet, insurance against a moment exactly like this. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By that time, Daniel had broken down the bathroom door and was pounding on Lucia's body with his fists, methodical and expressionless, like someone performing a task that needed to be completed. The officers pulled him off, handcuffed him, sat him on the couch while they called for an ambulance. Lucia was conscious but barely, her face swollen, her ribs aching, blood running from her nose and mouth. One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes and a tired voice, knelt beside her and said, "You're safe now. You're going to be okay. We're going to take care of you." Lucia wanted to believe her, but could not. She knew that safety was temporary, that Daniel would make bail, that he would find her, that this was not over. But it was over, in a way, because Daniel had finally gone too far. The injuries were too severe to explain away, too visible to ignore. The police took photographs, documented the scene, arrested Daniel not just for assault, but for attempted murder because the level of violence suggested intent to kill. Lucia was taken to the hospital, treated for a concussion, 3 broken ribs, extensive bruising, and a fractured cheekbone. The doctors asked if this had happened before, and Lucia, finally, said yes. She told them everything: the 2 years of escalating abuse, the isolation, the control, the fear. A social worker was called, and then an immigration attorney, and then a representative from a domestic violence organization. And suddenly Lucia was surrounded by people who believed her, who wanted to help her, who understood that she was a victim and not a problem to be solved. Daniel was held without bail. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a man who had seen too many domestic violence situations end in death, was determined to make this one stick. He charged Daniel with aggravated assault, kidnapping due to the isolation and control, and a hate crime enhancement because of Daniel's pattern of targeting immigrant women who were vulnerable due to their legal status. It turned out that Lucia was not the first. There had been another woman, 5 years earlier, who had left Daniel and returned to her home country rather than press charges, afraid of deportation, afraid of retaliation. The prosecutor tracked her down, convinced her to testify, built a case that demonstrated a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. The trial was brief. Daniel's defense attorney tried to argue that Lucia had been an unreliable narrator, that cultural differences had created misunderstandings, that the relationship had been mutually toxic. But the medical evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was consistent, and the jury did not deliberate for long. Daniel Reyes was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge, reading the sentence, said that men like Daniel relied on their victim's silence, on the assumption that no one would care enough to intervene, and that this case demonstrated what happened when the system finally paid attention. It was a small victory, but it came far too late to undo the damage. Lucia did not attend the sentencing. She had already left Mesa Verde, relocated to a different state through a victim protection program, given a new start that came with conditions and limitations, but also with freedom. She was granted AU visa, legal status for victims of violent crimes who cooperate with law enforcement, which gave her the right to work, to build a life, to exist in this country without fear of deportation. She found a job cleaning offices at night, work that was hard and poorly paid, but that belonged to her, that no one could take away. She rented a small apartment, made a few friends, began the slow process of rebuilding a sense of self that had been nearly destroyed. But the trauma did not leave just because she was safe. She woke up at night convinced that Daniel was in the room, that he had found her, that the walls were closing in. She flinched when men spoke to her, could not tolerate anyone standing too close, felt her heart rate spike in crowded spaces. A therapist explained that this was PTSD, that her nervous system had been rewired by years of sustained fear, that healing would take time and might never be complete. Lucia accepted this information without emotion. She was alive. That was more than she had expected a year ago. The question people asked when they heard her story was always the same. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you call the police the first time he hit you? Why did you stay? The questions were asked with genuine confusion, as if the answers were obvious. as if leaving an abusive relationship were as simple as walking out the door. Lucia tried to explain, but the explanation always felt inadequate. She stayed because she had nowhere to go. She stayed because her legal status depended on the marriage. She stayed because Daniel had convinced her that she was worthless, that no one else would want her, that she deserved what was happening to her. She stayed because leaving felt more dangerous than staying. She stayed because people are not rational when they are terrified, and terror had been her constant companion for 2 years. But there was another answer, one that Lucia rarely spoke aloud because it implicated more than just herself and Daniel. She stayed because the system failed her. She stayed because the neighbors heard and did nothing. She stayed because the few times she tried to reach out, she encountered walls instead of support, bureaucracy instead of compassion, fear instead of action. She stayed because everyone around her had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that her suffering was not their problem. And once a community makes that decision, once they agree to look away, the violence becomes invisible, and invisible violence can continue indefinitely. Daniel's co-workers were interviewed after the arrest. Several admitted that they had suspected something was wrong, that Lucia had seemed nervous around Daniel, that the few times they had seen her, she had been quiet and withdrawn. But they had not asked questions because it seemed intrusive, because Daniel was their friend, because they did not want to believe that someone they worked with every day could be capable of such sustained cruelty. Their silence had been a form of permission, a tacit agreement that what happened in Daniel's house was his business, even when what happened involved the systematic destruction of another person. The grocery store where Lucia had sometimes shopped reviewed their security footage after the trial. There were images of her with visible bruises, with a black eye, with her arm in a makeshift sling. No employee had ever asked if she was okay, if she needed help, if there was anything they could do. They had seen, and they had served her, and they had moved on to the next customer, because asking would have been awkward, would have required them to do something, would have made them responsible for a problem that was easier to ignore. The domestic violence organization that eventually helped Lucia published a report using her case as an example of systemic failure. They noted that immigrant women were disproportionately vulnerable to abuse because their legal status was often tied to their abusers, because they lacked social networks, because language barriers made it difficult to seek help, because they were isolated in communities that did not see them as fully human. The report made recommendations, policy changes, training programs for law enforcement, and social workers and healthcare providers. It was a good report, well-researched and well-intentioned, and it changed almost nothing because changing systems requires resources and political will and sustained attention, and all of those things are in short supply. Lucia's story circulated in the same way that all true crime stories circulate, passed from person to person, discussed, and analyzed and dissected. People expressed outrage, said this should never have been allowed to happen, said someone should have done something. But the someone they imagined was always someone else, some abstract authority figure or concerned neighbor, never themselves. The uncomfortable truth was that many people had known, or could have known, if they had been willing to look, to ask, to care. But caring is exhausting, and other people's tragedies are easy to compartmentalize. And so the cycle continues, a new victim replacing the old, the patterns repeating because the systems that allow them to repeat remain unchanged. What links Lucia's story to the one that preceded it is not the specific violence, but the structure of silence that surrounds it. In both cases, people saw signs and chose interpretations that allowed them to continue with their own lives undisturbed. In both cases, the truth was available to anyone willing to look for it, but looking required discomfort, required action, required admitting that something terrible was happening within reach, and that they had the power to intervene. Most people do not want that power because power comes with responsibility, and responsibility comes with guilt when you fail to act. The next story is different in its particulars, but identical in its architecture. It is about a woman who trusted institutions to care for her, who believed that systems existed to protect the vulnerable, who discovered too late that institutions are made of people, and people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes compound into tragedies that could have been prevented with a single phone call, a single moment of attention, a single act of basic human decency. Naomi Keller had lived alone in North Bay City for most of her adult life, and she had liked it that way. She was 53 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, with a small circle of friends and a larger circle of acquaintances who knew her as the woman who volunteered at the public library, who grew herbs on her apartment balcony, who always had time to help neighbors with small tasks. She was self-sufficient in the way that people who have managed chronic illness for decades learn to be, capable of advocating for herself, knowledgeable about her own needs, careful about maintaining the routines that kept her healthy. The illness was lupus, diagnosed in her 20s, managed through medication and lifestyle adjustments and a kind of vigilant awareness of her own body. She knew when a flare was coming, could feel it in the stiffness of her joints and the particular quality of fatigue that preceded the inflammation. She had good doctors, a rheumatologist who listened to her, a primary care physician who coordinated her care, a pharmacy that knew her by name. The system, when it worked well. The problem was that systems are fragile, and when they break in ways that are very hard to fix. Naomi had family, but they were distant both geographically and emotionally. A sister in Oregon, a brother in Florida, nieces and nephews she saw at weddings and funerals. They exchanged birthday cards and occasional phone calls, the kind of contact that maintains connection without requiring intimacy. Naomi did not mind. She had built a life that suited her, that revolved around her work as a freelance editor, her volunteer commitments, her friendships. She was not lonely. She was independent. There is a difference, though from the outside those two states can look identical. The hospitalization began with what Naomi thought was a routine flare. She had woken up with joint pain that was worse than usual, a fever that would not break, a rash spreading across her face and arms. She called her rheumatologist, who told her to go to the emergency room immediately, that this could be a serious complication, that lupus patients had to take these symptoms seriously. Naomi had driven herself to the hospital, checked in at the ER, and explained her medical history to the triage nurse. She was admitted quickly, given a bed in the observation unit, and started on 4 steroids to control the inflammation. The hospital was busy, understaffed, overwhelmed by a seasonal surge of flu cases and the normal chaos of an urban medical center. Naomi understood this. She had been a patient long enough to know that healthcare workers were doing their best under difficult circumstances, that delays were inevitable, that patience was required. She waited for the doctors to round, answered their questions, tried to be a good patient, the kind who did not complain or make demands. She trusted that the system would work, that the people caring for her were competent and attentive, that she would be treated and released, and able to return to her normal life. But something went wrong with the paperwork. Naomi's admission was entered into the system incorrectly, filed under a patient ID number that was 1 digit off from her actual number, associated with the wrong attending physician, placed in a queue that no one was actively monitoring. This kind of clerical error happens more often than hospitals admit, a consequence of electronic medical records that are supposed to streamline care, but that sometimes create new opportunities for mistakes. In most cases, the error is caught quickly, corrected, forgotten. In Naomi's case, it was not caught at all. Days passed. Naomi received her medications, was checked on by nurses, had blood drawn for labs. But no one seemed to be coordinating her care. No one seemed to have a plan for when she would be discharged. When she asked, the nurses said the doctor would be by soon, that everything was proceeding normally, that she just needed to be patient. Naomi trusted these assurances because what choice did she have? She was sick, she was in pain, she was not in a position to challenge the people who were supposed to be taking care of her. A week became 2 weeks. Naomi's condition stabilized, the flare subsided, but she was not discharged. She asked more insistently, said that she needed to go home, that she had work to do, that she had been in the hospital long enough. The responses became vague, contradictory. One nurse said the doctor had ordered more tests. Another said they were waiting for a specialist consultation. A third said there was a problem with her insurance and that billing needed to sort it out before she could leave. None of these explanations made sense, but Naomi did not know how to argue with them. She was not a difficult patient. She did not want to make trouble. Her friends noticed that she had not returned their calls. They texted, asking if everything was okay, if she needed anything. Naomi, using her cell phone from the hospital bed, responded that she was dealing with a health issue, that she would be in touch soon, that there was nothing to worry about. She said this because she believed it, because she assumed the hospital stay was temporary, because she did not want to burden anyone with concerns about something that would resolve itself. Her friends, reassured by her messages, stopped checking in quite so often. They had their own lives, their own problems. Naomi seemed to be handling things. There was no reason to worry. Naomi's sister called once during the first month. Naomi mentioned that she was in the hospital for a lupus flare, that it was taking longer than expected to get back on her feet, but that she was fine. The sister, distracted by her own family crisis, said she hoped Naomi felt better soon and ended the call after 10 minutes. She meant to call back the following week, but forgot. And then another week passed, and then a month, and then it seemed like too much time had gone by, and she felt guilty about not having called, and the guilt made it harder to call, and so she did not. This is how people drift away from each other, not through malice, but through the accumulation of small neglects, through the assumption that someone else is paying attention, that there is always time to reach out later. Inside the hospital, Naomi's situation deteriorated in ways that no one was tracking. Because her admission had been misfiled, no doctor was taking ownership of her case. Nurses continued to provide basic care, medications, meals, but there was no discharge plan because no one realized she needed a discharge plan. She became a ghost in the system, present physically but absent from any official record of active patients. When shift changes happened, information about her care was not passed along because there was no information to pass. She was simply a person in a bed, receiving maintenance care, waiting for something that was never going to happen because the people who should have made it happen did not know she existed. Naomi tried advocating for herself more forcefully as weeks became months. She demanded to see a supervisor, asked for her medical records, called the hospital's patient advocate office. But her complaints were routed through the same dysfunctional system that had created the problem in the first place. The patient advocate promised to look into the matter, then got pulled into other crises, then forgot. The supervisor said she would check with the attending physician, but there was no attending physician assigned to Naomi's case, and no one seemed to notice this fundamental impossibility. Naomi's frustration grew, but frustration without power is just noise, and the hospital was full of noise, so hers did not stand out. Her friends stopped texting. They assumed that Naomi was recovering at home, that she was busy, that she would reach out when she was ready. Her phone, which she had been using to maintain the illusion of normalcy, eventually died because the charger had been misplaced during a room transfer and no one had thought to replace it. Without the phone, Naomi had no way to contact the outside world, no way to tell anyone that she was still in the hospital, still trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that made no sense. She asked nurses to help her make calls, but they were always too busy, always promising to come back later, always forgetting. As the months stretched on, Naomi began to change. The person who had been confident and self-advocating became passive, defeated, convinced that there was no way out. Institutions have that effect on people. They wear you down, teach you that resistance is futile, that accepting your circumstances is easier than fighting systems that are indifferent to your suffering. Naomi stopped asking when she would be discharged. She stopped asking for anything. She existed in a state of permanent waiting, not quite living but not quite dying, suspended in a limbo that should not have been possible, but that was possible because no one was paying attention. A year after her admission, a billing clerk noticed an irregularity in the records. A patient had been listed as occupying a bed for an impossibly long time, without any documented discharge plan or active treatment protocol. The clerk flagged the file, sent it to a supervisor, who sent it to the medical director, who finally, belatedly, realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong. An investigation was launched. Naomi's case was reviewed. The clerical error was discovered. Apologies were offered, though apologies could not return the year that Naomi had lost, could not undo the isolation and confusion and despair she had experienced. Naomi was discharged immediately, sent home with a folder full of paperwork and a promise that the hospital would conduct a thorough review of what had happened and implement new procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. She walked out of the hospital into a world that had continued without her, a year older, a year weaker, a year more broken than when she had entered. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it, except covered in dust and filled with stale air. Her mail had piled up, notices and bills and advertisements, evidence of a life that had been put on hold without her consent. Her friends were shocked when they heard what had happened. They felt guilty for not having checked on her more persistently, for having accepted her silence as normal, for having assumed that she was fine. But what could they have done differently? She had told them she was okay. She had responded to their messages, at least at first. There had been no indication that anything was seriously wrong. No reason to suspect that she was being held in a bureaucratic loop that no one was monitoring. Their guilt was real, but it was also misplaced. The failure was not theirs. It was institutional, systemic, the result of a healthcare system so large and so complex that people could fall through the cracks without anyone noticing. Naomi's sister flew out immediately when she learned the truth. She had been told by the hospital, a formal notification that was both apologetic and defensive, explaining the clerical error but also implying that these things happen, that systems are imperfect, that no one was really at fault. The sister was furious, demanded meetings with hospital administrators, threatened lawsuits, insisted that someone be held accountable. But accountability in large institutions is a slippery thing. The person who made the initial data entry error had left the hospital months ago. The supervisors who should have caught the mistake had been overseeing hundreds of patients and could not be expected to notice one misfiled case. The system itself was blamed, and the system, being abstract, could not be punished. Naomi filed a lawsuit. It took 3 years to work its way through the courts, 3 years of depositions and document reviews and mediation sessions. The hospital's legal team argued that while the error was regrettable, no permanent physical harm had been done to Naomi, that she had received adequate medical care during her stay, that the psychological distress she claimed was not quantifiable in a way that justified significant damages. Naomi's attorney countered that a year of her life had been stolen, that the trauma of being forgotten by an institution, the psychological impact was harder to measure but more devastating. Naomi had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to navigate the world without needing help from others. The hospital experience had stripped that away, had taught her that she was powerless in the face of institutional indifference, that her voice did not matter, that she could be forgotten and no one would notice or care. She developed depression, which made sense to her therapist, but which Naomi experienced as a fundamental betrayal by her own mind. She had survived the hospital. She should have been relieved, grateful, ready to move forward. Instead, she felt hollow, as if the year in limbo had erased something essential that could not be recovered. Her sister tried to help, invited Naomi to move to Oregon, to live with her family, to have support and company. Naomi refused. She did not want to be a burden, did not want to lose what remained of her independence, did not want to admit that she could not take care of herself anymore. She stayed in her apartment, alone, going through the motions of daily life without any real engagement. Her friends stopped calling after a while, worn down by her unresponsiveness, unsure how to help someone who would not accept help. The isolation that had trapped her in the hospital now trapped her at home, different in form but identical in effect. The question people asked when they heard about Naomi's case was how such a thing could happen. How could a patient be forgotten for an entire year? How could no one notice? The answers were bureaucratic and unsatisfying. The data entry error had created a cascade of failures. The high patient volume had meant that no individual staff member had a complete picture of who was in the hospital and why. The electronic medical records system, designed to improve efficiency, had actually created new vulnerabilities because people trusted the computer to flag problems, and the computer only knew what was entered into it. The error had been compounded by the fact that Naomi was a good patient, quiet and cooperative, not making demands, not causing problems, which meant she did not draw the attention that might have revealed the administrative mistake. But those explanations, while accurate, missed the deeper truth, which was that Naomi had been forgotten because she was forgettable. She had no family nearby to advocate for her, no daily visitors to ask why she was still hospitalized, no employer to notice her extended absence. She existed at the margins of several social networks, but at the center of none, which meant that when she disappeared into the hospital system, no one raised an alarm. The people who might have noticed were busy with their own lives, and the people who should have noticed were overwhelmed by their own caseloads. And so Naomi slipped through every net that was supposed to catch her, and by the time anyone realized she had fallen, a year had passed. The hospital's internal review, conducted after the settlement, identified 17 separate points where the error should have been caught and corrected. 17 moments when a person could have asked a question, checked a record, followed up on an inconsistency. But at each of those moments, other demands had taken priority, other patients had seemed more urgent, other tasks had claimed attention. The review concluded with recommendations and procedural changes, but it could not, address the fundamental challenge, which is that healthcare systems are designed around efficiency rather than around care, and efficiency requires standardization, and standardization fails when individual cases deviate from expected patterns. Naomi's story became a case study in medical ethics courses, an example of systemic failure, a cautionary tale about the importance of patient advocacy and institutional oversight. Students discussed what should have been done differently, debated questions of responsibility and accountability, wrote papers analyzing the failures. But Naomi herself was absent from these discussions, reduced to a teaching tool, a problem to be solved in retrospect, a life that mattered only as an example of what not to do. She died 4 years after her discharge, at the age of 58, from complications related to her lupus. The extended hospital stay had accelerated the progression of her disease, and the psychological trauma had made it difficult for her to maintain the careful management that chronic illness requires. Her death was not directly caused by the hospital's error, but it was not unrelated either. The years she spent forgotten had set in motion a decline that she could not reverse, had broken something in her that never healed. Her sister was the one who found her, having driven out after Naomi had missed several phone calls. She was in her apartment, in her bed, as if she had simply decided to stop fighting. There was no note, no explanation, just the quiet end of a life that had been marked by profound loneliness disguised as independence. The sister arranged the funeral, a small service attended by a handful of people who had known Naomi, but who could not claim to have understood her, who felt the guilt that comes from realizing you were part of someone's life, but not enough of it. The hospital sent flowers to the funeral, a gesture that the sister found offensive but that she accepted because what was the alternative? The card expressed condolences and noted Naomi's strength and courage, words that meant nothing because they came from an institution that had demonstrated it did not know her, had never really seen her, had lost her, and then found her, and then lost her again in a different way. If you've been listening and these stories are resonating with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment about where you're listening from. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people. What connects Naomi's story to the others is the theme of invisibility. Ethan was invisible because people accepted his absence. Lucia was invisible because people chose not to see her suffering. Naomi was invisible because the systems designed to care for her were blind to her existence. In each case, the invisibility was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices, individual and collective decisions to prioritize convenience over truth, comfort over intervention, efficiency over humanity. The next story is about a different kind of invisibility, the kind that exists in digital spaces where people present curated versions of themselves, where trust is built through screens rather than through shared physical space, where the distance between what someone claims to be and what they actually are can be vast and impossible to verify until it is too late. Noah Whitaker was 23 years old and living in Ironwood Crossing, a small river town where everyone knew everyone, where the pace of life was slow enough that young people talked constantly about leaving but rarely did. Noah had graduated from the local community college with a degree in graphic design, but work in that field was scarce in a town whose primary industries were agriculture and small-scale manufacturing. He worked part-time at a print shop, designing flyers and business cards, and spent his evenings in his apartment working on freelance projects that paid little but kept his skills sharp. He was lonely in the particular way that people in small towns can be lonely, surrounded by familiar faces but disconnected from meaningful relationships. His high school friends had mostly left for larger cities, and the people he worked with were either much older or much younger, belonging to different life stages that did not overlap with his. He had tried dating locally but found the pool limited, the options unappealing, the whole enterprise exhausting in a place where everyone knew everyone's history and privacy was a fiction. So Noah, like many people his age, turned to the internet for connection. He joined forums dedicated to graphic design, participated in online communities around his interests, and eventually, tentatively, created a profile on a dating app that catered to people looking for serious relationships rather than casual hookups. He was careful about it, aware of the risks, skeptical of the promises. But he was also hopeful, or at least open to the possibility that somewhere out there was someone who might understand him, who might want the same things he wanted, who might see him as something other than a guy who worked at a print shop in a town no one had heard of. He matched with Elise Varn in early spring. Her profile said she was 25, lived 2 hours away in a slightly larger town, worked as a veterinary technician, loved hiking and photography and old movies. Her photos showed a woman with dark curly hair and a shy smile, posing with dogs, standing in front of mountain vistas, looking exactly like the kind of person Noah imagined himself being compatible with. They started messaging, tentative at first, the usual getting-to-know-you questions, and then more personal, more revealing, until they were talking every day, long conversations that stretched late into the night. Elise told Noah about her difficult childhood, about parents who had not understood her, about feeling like an outsider in her own family. She talked about her love for animals, about how working with them was the only thing that made her feel useful. She shared her insecurities, her fears that she would never find someone who accepted her, her worry that she was too broken to be loved. Noah, who had his own insecurities and fears, felt a deep recognition. Here was someone who understood what it was like to feel out of place, who was willing to be vulnerable, who seemed to value the same kind of emotional honesty that Noah had always thought was important but had rarely found. They talked for weeks before Elise suggested they meet in person. Noah was nervous but excited, ready to take the next step, to see if the connection they had built online could translate into something real. Elise said she would drive to Ironwood Crossing, that she wanted to see where Noah lived, to walk by the river he had told her about. They planned to meet at a coffee shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon, a public place, safe and neutral, the kind of first meeting that everyone recommends. But the night before the meeting, Elise sent a message saying she was having car trouble, that she would not be able to make it. Noah was disappointed but understanding. These things happen. They rescheduled for the following weekend. And then Elise canceled again, this time citing a work emergency. And then again, family obligations. Noah started to feel uneasy, started to notice the pattern, but when he mentioned it, Elise became upset, said that Noah did not trust her, that she was trying her best, that if he did not believe her then maybe they should just stop talking. Noah apologized, said he did trust her, said he was just frustrated, not suspicious. Elise accepted the apology and promised they would meet soon, definitely soon. In the meantime, their conversations deepened. Elise started asking Noah about his finances, casual questions at first, about his job and his expenses and his plans for the future. Noah, not seeing any harm in it, answered honestly. He mentioned that he had been saving money, a small fund he was building toward eventually moving somewhere with better job prospects. Elise said that was smart, that she was trying to save too, but that unexpected expenses kept setting her back. She mentioned medical bills, car repairs, things that sounded plausible and that Noah sympathized with. He offered advice, suggested budgeting strategies, tried to be supportive. And then Elise asked for money. Just a loan, she said, just until her next paycheck, because she was short on rent and her landlord was threatening eviction. She hated to ask, was embarrassed to ask, but Noah was the only person she trusted, the only person who understood her situation. It was not a large amount, $200, enough to matter, but not enough to devastate Noah's savings. He hesitated, uncomfortable with the request, but also wanting to help, wanting to prove that he was trustworthy, that he could be relied upon. He sent the money through a payment app, and Elise thanked him profusely, promised to pay him back within 2 weeks. She did not pay him back. When Noah asked about it gently, she said there had been another emergency, a sick pet that needed surgery, that she felt terrible about not being able to repay him yet, but that she would as soon as she could. Noah said he understood, that there was no rush, that he was just glad he could help. And then Elise asked for more money. Another emergency, another crisis, always something urgent and unpredictable. Noah sent smaller amounts, $50 here, $75 there, telling himself that this was temporary, that Elise was going through a rough patch, that once they finally met in person they could sort everything out. But they never met in person. Every planned meeting was canceled. Every excuse sounded reasonable in isolation, but suspicious in aggregate. Noah started searching for Elise online, trying to verify her identity, looking for social media profiles that matched her photos. He found inconsistencies. The photos she had sent him appeared on other profiles, associated with different names, different ages, different locations. When he confronted her, Elise said those were old accounts, that she had changed her name for privacy reasons, that people stole photos all the time and there was nothing she could do about it. She became defensive, accused Noah of stalking her, said that if he did not trust her then they should end things. Noah, afraid of losing the connection, afraid of admitting that he had been fooled, backed down. Over the next few months, Noah sent Elise over $2,000. His savings were gone, his credit card was maxed out, and he had nothing to show for it except a relationship that existed only in text messages and voice calls. A person he had never met who claimed to love him, but who never seemed able to prove it through action. His friends, the few he still talked to, noticed that he seemed stressed, withdrawn, distracted. When they asked what was wrong, Noah said it was work stuff, financial stress, nothing to worry about. He could not admit the truth, could not say that he had been sending money to someone he had never met, because saying it out loud would make him sound stupid, gullible, exactly the kind of person he had always thought he was too smart to be. And then Elise suggested they finally meet, for real this time, no more excuses. She said she wanted to make things right, wanted to repay him everything she owed, wanted to start their relationship properly. She suggested a location, a small state park halfway between their towns, a place that was public but remote, beautiful and quiet, perfect for a long overdue first date. Noah agreed immediately, relief flooding through him. This was it, the moment when everything would make sense, when the confusion and doubt would resolve into clarity. The state park was an hour's drive from Ironwood Crossing, a place Noah had been to a few times as a kid, but not recently. He arrived early, parked in the small gravel lot, walked down to the designated meeting spot by the river. Elise had said she would be there at 2 in the afternoon. Noah waited, checking his phone, watching the trail for someone who matched her photos. At 2:15, a woman approached, but she was older than Elise's photos, heavier, with blonde hair instead of dark curls. She walked directly to Noah and said his name as a question, and when he nodded, confused, she introduced herself as Elise. Noah did not know what to say. The person in front of him bore no resemblance to the photos, to the persona he had been talking to for months. Before he could process this, before he could ask any questions, a man appeared from the trees, large and silent, moving with purpose. Elise stepped back, and the man stepped forward, and Noah understood too late that he was in danger, that this meeting was not about romance or reconciliation, that he had been lured here for a reason that had nothing to do with love. The man demanded Noah's wallet, his phone, his car keys. Noah, terrified, complied immediately, handing over everything without resistance. The man checked the wallet, found only $20 in cash, swore, and hit Noah hard across the face. Noah fell, tasted blood, heard Elise say something about the bank, about withdrawals, about how much Noah had said he had in savings. The man pulled Noah to his feet, dragged him toward the parking lot, forced him into his own car. They drove to a bank in a town Noah did not recognize, the man in the driver's seat, Noah in the passenger seat with Elise in the back, her hand gripping his shoulder as if she were comforting him rather than participating in his kidnapping. The man told Noah exactly what to say at the ATM, how much to withdraw, what would happen if he tried to signal for help. Noah did as he was told, withdrew the maximum daily limit, handed over the cash. They drove to another bank, repeated the process, and then another. By the time they were done, Noah's accounts were empty, drained of the little money he had left. They drove back to the state park, to the same empty lot where this had started. The man told Noah to get out of the car, to walk toward the trail, to not look back. Noah obeyed, his mind blank with fear, his body moving on autopilot. He heard the car door slam, heard the engine start, heard the sound of gravel as they drove away. And then he heard footsteps behind him, heavy and fast, and before he could turn, before he could run, pain exploded in the back of his head, and everything went dark. Noah woke up in the hospital 3 days later. A hiker had found him in the woods off the trail, unconscious and bleeding, and had called emergency services. Noah had been airlifted to a trauma center, treated for a severe skull fracture, brain swelling, multiple contusions. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive, that whoever had hit him had clearly intended to kill him, that he had survived because the hiker had found him quickly enough to get him medical attention before the injuries became fatal. The police were waiting when Noah regained consciousness. They asked him what had happened, and Noah, struggling to form words through the haze of pain and medication, told them everything. The dating app, the months of conversation, the money he had sent, the meeting at the park, the robbery, the attack. The detectives listened without visible judgment, though Noah could sense their skepticism, their unspoken questions about why he had been so trusting, so foolish, so willing to ignore obvious red flags. They investigated, but the trail was cold. The dating profile had been deleted. The payment app transactions had been routed through accounts that were closed or fake. The phone number Elise had used was a burner, no longer in service. The car Noah had been forced into had been stolen, later found abandoned in another county. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no security footage from the banks that showed anyone other than Noah. Elise and the man who had attacked him had been careful, professional, experienced in this particular kind of crime. It turned out Noah was not the first victim. The police connected his case to at least 7 others across 3 states, all following the same pattern. A fake dating profile, months of emotional manipulation, requests for money, a proposed in-person meeting that turned into robbery and assault. The victims were all young men, all living in small towns, all socially isolated enough that they were vulnerable to someone offering connection and understanding. The amounts stolen varied, from a few $100s to several thousand, but the emotional damage was consistent. These men had believed they were in relationships, had trusted someone they thought cared about them, had been betrayed in a way that was both financial and deeply personal. A task force was formed to investigate the crime ring. They eventually identified Elise Varn, though that was not her real name, as part of a group that specialized in romance scams. The real woman whose photos had been used had no connection to the crimes, was herself a victim of identity theft, horrified to learn that her image had been used to manipulate vulnerable people. The actual Elise was a woman in her 40s with a long criminal record, fraud and theft and assault. Someone who had learned that lonely people were easy targets, that the internet made it simple to create convincing personas, that most victims were too embarrassed to report what had happened to them. She was eventually arrested in another state, caught running the same scam on a different victim who had been more cautious, who had alerted police before the in-person meeting. The man who had assaulted Noah was identified as her partner, arrested at the same time. They were charged with multiple counts of fraud, kidnapping, robbery, and attempted murder. The trial took place 2 years after Noah's attack, and he was asked to testify, to describe what had happened, to face the people who had nearly killed him. Noah almost did not go. The thought of seeing Elise again, of being in the same room with her, of having to relive the experience in front of strangers, was overwhelming. But the prosecutor convinced him that his testimony was important, that without it the jury might not understand the full scope of the crime, the psychological manipulation that had preceded the violence. Noah agreed, though it cost him something to do so. Sitting in the witness stand, looking at Elise in her orange jumpsuit, Noah barely recognized her as the person he had talked to for months. Or rather, he recognized that there had never been a person, only a performance, a carefully constructed fiction designed to exploit his loneliness and his hope. She looked at him without emotion, without recognition, as if he were a stranger, which in a sense he was. The person she had pretended to be had never existed, and the person she actually was had no investment in Noah beyond what he could provide. Noah's testimony was detailed and painful. He described the conversations, the slow build of trust, the requests for money, the justifications he had made to himself, the hope that had blinded him to the inconsistencies. He described the meeting, the moment of realization, the terror, the attack. He spoke in a flat, mechanical tone, as if he were reading someone else's story, because the alternative was breaking down completely, and he had promised himself he would not do that in front of her. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Noah had been a willing participant in a financial arrangement, that the relationship had been transactional from the start, that he had made the choice to send money and therefore bore some responsibility for what had happened. The prosecutor objected, the judge sustained, but the implication hung in the air. Noah felt it, the judgment, the suggestion that he had been stupid, that he had brought this on himself, that his victimization was somehow his fault. The jury convicted Elise and her partner on all counts. They were sentenced to 25 years in prison, a significant sentence that reflected the severity of the crimes and the number of victims. The judge, reading the sentence, said that people like the defendants preyed on human vulnerability, that they weaponized loneliness, that they deserved no leniency. It was a just sentence, but justice did not undo what had been done. Noah left the courtroom feeling empty rather than vindicated. The trial had forced him to relive the worst experience of his life, to admit publicly to choices he was ashamed of, to see himself through the eyes of people who thought he should have known better. He understood their judgment even as he resented it. He should have known better. The signs had been there. But loneliness makes people willing to ignore signs, willing to believe in possibilities that seem too good to be true, willing to invest in hope even when evidence suggests the hope is misplaced. The physical injuries healed, mostly. Noah still had headaches, occasional dizziness, a scar on the back of his head hidden by his hair. The doctors said he had been lucky, that brain injuries could have been much worse, that he had recovered well. But the psychological injuries did not heal. Noah developed severe anxiety around any kind of social interaction, online or in person. He deleted all his social media accounts, avoided dating apps, stopped trying to meet new people. The world felt dangerous in a way it had not before, full of people who might be lying, who might want to hurt him, who might see him only as an opportunity for exploitation. He moved away from Ironwood Crossing, could not stand living in the place where people knew what had happened to him, where he could see the pity and judgment in their eyes. He found a new job in a new city, working from home, designing websites for clients he never met in person. It was a lonely life, but it was safe, and safety mattered more than connection now. He told himself he was being smart, protecting himself, learning from his mistakes. But he also knew he was letting fear dictate his choices, was allowing one terrible experience to define the rest of his life. His family tried to help, but they did not understand. They thought he should just move on, should put the experience behind him, should be grateful he had survived. They did not understand that surviving was not the same as recovering, that the trauma was not about the physical attack, but about the betrayal, the realization that someone had spent months earning his trust for the sole purpose of destroying him. They did not understand that Noah no longer knew how to trust his own judgment, that every interaction felt suspect, that he could not tell the difference between genuine connection and manipulation because the line between them had proven to be invisible. The support group for scam victims helped more than his family did. There were others who understood, who had experienced similar betrayals, who could talk about the shame without judgment, who knew what it was like to blame yourself for being victimized. They shared strategies for coping, for rebuilding trust slowly, for accepting that what had happened was not their fault even though it felt like it was. Noah attended meetings regularly for over a year, found some comfort in the shared experience, but eventually stopped going because the meetings themselves were a reminder of what he was trying to move past. He dated again, eventually, very cautiously, very slowly. He met someone through a friend, a setup that felt safer than an app, someone who had been vetted by a person Noah trusted. The relationship was good, stable, based on honesty and mutual respect. But Noah could never fully relax into it, could never stop waiting for the moment when his partner would reveal themselves to be someone else, when the mask would slip and he would discover he had been fooled again. His partner, patient and understanding, tried to reassure him, but reassurance could not undo the damage. Noah carried the fear everywhere, a permanent weight, a scar that never fully faded. The question people asked when they heard Noah's story was why he had not seen through Elise's deception sooner. The answer was both simple and complicated. He had not seen through it because he had not wanted to see through it. He had been lonely, and she had offered connection. He had been isolated, and she had offered understanding. He had been vulnerable, and she had exploited that vulnerability with skill and precision. People want to believe they would be smarter, more skeptical, less trusting. But most people, given the right circumstances, given the right manipulator, would make similar choices. Loneliness is powerful. Hope is powerful. And people who prey on loneliness and hope understand this better than anyone. Noah's story is not unique. Romance scams are common, increasingly sophisticated, targeting hundreds of thousands of people every year. Most victims never report what happened because the shame is too great, because they do not want to admit they were fooled, because they blame themselves for trusting someone who turned out to be untrustworthy. The crimes are underreported, which means the criminals often go unpunished, which means the cycle continues. What makes Noah's case distinctive is the violence. Most romance scams end with financial loss, but not physical harm. The decision to lure Noah to an isolated location, to rob him, to attack him with intent to kill, that was an escalation that suggested desperation or cruelty or both. The investigators believed that Elise and her partner had decided Noah knew too much, had seen too much, that leaving him alive was a risk they were not willing to take. Noah had survived not through any action of his own, but through chance, through the presence of a hiker who happened to be on that trail at that time, through luck that could easily have gone the other way. Noah thought about that often, about how close he had come to dying in those woods, about how his body might have lain there for days or weeks before anyone found him, about how his disappearance would have been a mystery, another person who vanished without explanation. He thought about Ethan Holloway, about Lucia Moreno, about all the people whose stories ended badly because no one noticed soon enough, because the systems failed, because trust was misplaced. He had been luckier than them. He was alive. But being alive did not feel like enough when the life he was living was defined by fear and isolation and the permanent knowledge that people could not be trusted, not really, not safely. The story that follows is the last, and in some ways it is the most difficult to tell because it happened far from home, in a place where distance complicated everything, where help was harder to find, where the usual safety nets did not exist. It is about a woman who thought she was being careful, who made reasonable choices based on incomplete information, who trusted her instincts right up until the moment those instincts failed her. Anya Volkov was 32 years old, a high school English teacher in a suburb outside Seattle, and she had been feeling restless for months before she decided to take the trip. The restlessness was not about her job, which she loved, or her life, which was stable and comfortable. It was about the sense that she was moving through the same routines without variation, that the world was larger than the small corner she inhabited, that she needed to shake herself out of the comfortable patterns that had come to define her existence. She chose Solara Bay because it was beautiful and relatively safe, a small island nation in the Pacific known for its beaches and its laid-back culture. She had read travel blogs, checked safety ratings, booked a hotel that had good reviews, and was located in a well-populated tourist area. She was not reckless. She was careful, methodical, the kind of person who researched everything thoroughly before making decisions. The trip was a gift to herself, 2 weeks of disconnection from work and routine, a chance to read and swim, and think about what she wanted from the next phase of her life. The first week was exactly what she had hoped it would be. Anya spent her days on the beach, reading novels she had been meaning to get to for years, swimming in water so clear she could see the bottom even at depth, eating at small restaurants where the food was simple and fresh. She felt herself relaxing in a way she had not in years, felt the tightness in her shoulders ease, felt her mind quiet. She was alone, but not lonely, enjoying her own company, not needing to perform for anyone or meet anyone's expectations. She downloaded a dating app halfway through the first week, more out of boredom than any real intent. She was not looking for a relationship, but she was curious about what it would be like to meet someone in a place where there were no expectations, no pressure, no future complications. She matched with several people, had pleasant but forgettable conversations, and then matched with Marcus, a local man who worked as a tour guide, and who wrote incomplete sentences and seemed genuinely interested in showing her parts of the island that tourists did not usually see. They met for coffee at a place Marcus suggested, a small cafe near the harbor that served strong espresso and pastries that were too sweet, but in a good way. Marcus was charming, attentive, easy to talk to. He was in his late 30s, well-traveled despite having grown up on the island, knowledgeable about local history and ecology in a way that did not feel performative. Anya liked him immediately, felt comfortable with him, appreciated that he treated her as a person rather than as a tourist to be impressed or exploited. They spent the afternoon together, walking through the old part of town, visiting a small museum that Marcus said most visitors skipped, sitting on a pier watching boats come and go. The conversation was easy, ranging from books to travel to work to the small disappointments and satisfactions of daily life. When Marcus suggested they meet again the next day, Anya agreed without hesitation. The second date was longer, more intimate. Marcus took her to a beach that was harder to access, where the sand was darker and the water was rougher, but also more dramatic, more beautiful. They swam, talked, shared a picnic that Marcus had prepared. He kissed her as the sun was setting, and it felt right, natural, the kind of moment that happens when two people are attracted to each other and unencumbered by the complications of real life. Anya allowed herself to enjoy it, allowed herself to imagine that maybe this could be something. Maybe not a relationship, but at least a meaningful connection, a good memory to take home. They saw each other almost every day for the rest of her trip. Marcus introduced her to his friends, took her to places that were not in any guidebook, cooked for her in his small apartment that overlooked the water. Anya felt herself falling, not in love exactly, but into something that felt like possibility, like the beginning of something that could develop into more if circumstances were different. She told Marcus she would come back, that she wanted to see him again, that maybe they could figure out a way to make this work despite the distance. Marcus said he wanted that too, that he had not felt this way about anyone in a long time, that Anya was special. On her last night on the island, Marcus suggested they spend it at his apartment, that he would cook her a special meal, that they could have a proper goodbye. Anya agreed, though part of her felt sad about the goodbye, about returning to her regular life, about the uncertainty of what this connection would become once she was no longer here. She packed her bags at the hotel, checked out early so she would not have to rush in the morning, and took a taxi to Marcus's place. The dinner was beautiful. Marcus had cooked fish he had bought that morning from a local fisherman, had made a salad with vegetables from a neighbor's garden, had opened a bottle of wine that he said was saved for special occasions. They ate slowly, talked about Anya's plans to return, about how they would stay in touch, about the possibility of Marcus visiting Seattle. The conversation was warm, hopeful, full of the kind of promises that people make when they do not want something good to end. After dinner, Marcus suggested they watch the stars from his balcony. Anya agreed, feeling relaxed from the wine and the food and the comfort of his company. They sat close together, his arm around her shoulders, talking less now, just enjoying the night air and the sound of the ocean. And then Marcus's mood shifted, subtle at first, his arm tightening slightly, his voice taking on a different tone when he asked if Anya was planning to see anyone else when she got back home. The question surprised her. It seemed to come from nowhere, to carry an intensity that did not match the casual nature of their relationship. Anya said she did not have specific plans, that she was not seeing anyone seriously, that she had enjoyed her time with Marcus and wanted to see where things went. She meant it as reassurance, but Marcus seemed to hear it differently. He asked if that meant she was keeping her options open, if she was treating him as a vacation fling, if she had ever really meant any of the things she had said. Anya tried to de-escalate, to explain that she had been sincere, that the distance made things complicated but that she wanted to try. But Marcus was not listening. Or he was listening but interpreting everything through a lens of suspicion and possessiveness that Anya had not seen before. He accused her of leading him on, of using him for entertainment, of planning to forget about him the moment she got on the plane. Anya said that was not true, that she cared about him, but her denials only seemed to make him angrier. He stood up abruptly, paced the small balcony, his hands clenched into fists. Anya felt the first real spark of fear, the realization that she was alone in an apartment with someone she suddenly did not know, in a country where she had no connections, no support system, no clear way to get help if she needed it. She stood as well, said she thought maybe she should go, that they were both tired and could talk about this tomorrow before her flight. Marcus blocked her path back into the apartment, said they were not done talking, that she owed him an explanation. The situation deteriorated quickly after that. Marcus grabbed Anya's wrist when she tried to move past him, pulled her back roughly, said she was not leaving until they resolved this. Anya tried to stay calm, tried to use the de-escalation techniques she had learned in a self-defense class years ago, tried to speak softly and avoid arguing. But calmness did not work. It only seemed to frustrate Marcus more, as if her composure were an insult, evidence that she did not care enough to fight back. He hit her, open-handed across the face, the same kind of slap that Daniel had used on Lucia, shocking not because of the pain, but because of what it represented, the crossing of a line that could not be uncrossed. Anya stumbled backward, hit the balcony railing, felt her vision blur. Marcus was on her immediately, his hands around her throat, his face close to hers, saying things she could not process through the panic and the lack of air. She clawed at his hands, kicked at him, tried to scream but could not get enough breath. And then, as suddenly as it had started, he let go. Anya collapsed to the ground, gasping, her throat burning, her mind struggling to understand what had just happened. Marcus was crying, saying he was sorry, that he did not mean it, that she had made him so angry, that this was her fault for not understanding how much he cared. He knelt beside her, tried to touch her face, and Anya flinched away, scrambled to her feet, ran for the door. He caught her before she reached it, tackled her to the ground, and this time there was no pretense of control, no crying or apologizing, just violence, pure and purposeful. Anya fought as hard as she could, but Marcus was larger, stronger, fueled by something she could not understand or reason with. The last thing she remembered was his hands around her throat again, tighter this time, and the terrible understanding that she was going to die here, in this apartment, in this country, and no one would know what had happened until it was far too late. Anya did not die, though it was close. A neighbor, hearing the sounds of the struggle through the thin walls, called the police. They arrived while Marcus was still choking her, broke down the door when he would not respond to their knocking, pulled him off her body and restrained him while paramedics worked to stabilize her. Anya was unconscious, not breathing, her pulse weak and irregular. They performed CPR on the apartment floor, got her breathing again, rushed her to the hospital where she spent 3 days in intensive care, sedated and intubated. Her family notified by the American embassy that their daughter had been the victim of a violent assault and might not survive. She did survive, but the recovery was long and complicated. Her throat had been damaged, her voice reduced to a painful rasp that would take months of therapy to improve. She had broken ribs from being thrown to the ground, bruises that covered most of her body, a concussion that left her confused and disoriented for weeks. But the physical injuries, severe as they were not the hardest part. The hardest part was the psychological aftermath, the knowledge that she had been so fundamentally wrong about someone, that her judgment had nearly cost her life, that the trip she had taken to find peace had ended in trauma. Her family flew to Solara Bay immediately, navigated the unfamiliar medical system, dealt with police and embassy officials and hospital administrators. They wanted to bring Anya home as soon as possible, but the doctors said she was not stable enough to fly, that she needed more time to heal before she could endure the long flight back to the United States. So they waited, staying in a hotel near the hospital, visiting Anya every day, trying to make sense of what had happened. The police investigation was thorough but also frustrating. Marcus was arrested and charged with attempted murder, and he confessed almost immediately, seemed relieved to confess, as if the violence had been building in him for a long time and Anya had simply been the person who happened to be there when it finally erupted. He told the police that Anya had disrespected him, that she had treated him like he did not matter, that he had tried to make her understand, and she had refused. His version of events bore no resemblance to reality, but it was his version, and he believed it completely. The trial was scheduled quickly by American standards, delayed endlessly by local standards. Anya was asked to stay in the country to testify, but she was desperate to leave, to return home, to be anywhere other than the place where she had nearly died. The prosecutor understood, but said her testimony was crucial, that without it the case against Marcus might be weaker, that she owed it to herself and to other potential victims to see this through. Anya agreed reluctantly, extended her stay, lived in a kind of limbo where she was physically recovering but psychologically trapped. When the trial finally happened, Anya testified from a video link, unable to bear the thought of being in the same room with Marcus, even with security and distance and the protection of the legal system. She described the relationship, the shift in Marcus's behavior, the assault, the fear. She spoke in her damaged voice, pausing frequently to sip water, to compose herself, to push through the memories that felt both distant and immediate. Marcus watched her testimony on a screen, his expression blank, as if he were watching a stranger describe events that had nothing to do with him. The jury convicted him. The sentence was 15 years, longer than typical for assault in that jurisdiction, but justified by the severity of the injuries and the premeditated nature of the attack. The judge said that Marcus had abused Anya's trust, had used his familiarity with the island to isolate her, had committed an act of violence that reflected both personal pathology and a broader cultural problem of male entitlement and violence against women. It was a strong statement, but it did not change what had happened, did not undo the damage, did not give Anya back the sense of safety she had lost. Anya returned to Seattle 2 weeks after the trial. Her family met her at the airport, drove her to their house, insisted she stay with them rather than returning to her apartment. Anya agreed, too exhausted to argue, too broken to imagine living alone. She spent the first month sleeping, eating when reminded, moving through the house like a ghost. Her physical injuries continued to heal, but the psychological wounds seemed to deepen. She had nightmares every night, woke up gasping, convinced that Marcus was in the room, that the attack was happening again. Her school was supportive, gave her a leave of absence, told her to take as much time as she needed. But time did not fix anything. Weeks became months, and Anya was no better, no more functional, no closer to being able to return to her life. She started therapy, talked to a counselor who specialized in trauma, tried the medications that were supposed to help with anxiety and depression. Some things helped a little. Nothing helped enough. The hardest part was the guilt. Anya knew intellectually that the attack was not her fault, that Marcus was responsible for his own actions, that she had done nothing to deserve what had happened. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. She could not stop replaying her choices, wondering what she could have done differently, how she could have seen the warning signs she now convinced herself must have been there. The guilt was irrational, but it was also overwhelming, a weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to function, hard to imagine a future that was not defined by what had happened. Her friends tried to help, but most of them did not know what to say. They offered sympathy and support, but they also asked questions that revealed their discomfort, their need to believe that Anya had made a mistake they would not have made. Why had she gone to his apartment alone? Why had she not left when he started acting strangely? Why had she trusted someone she barely knew? The questions were framed as concern, but they functioned as accusation, as reassurance to her friends that they were different, smarter, safer, that this could not happen to them. Only a few people seemed to understand that Anya had not done anything wrong, that meeting someone while traveling was normal, that trusting someone who seemed trustworthy was reasonable, that the violence had come from Marcus and Marcus alone. Those few people were the ones Anya stayed in contact with, the ones who did not need her to have made mistakes in order to make sense of what had happened. She tried to return to work after 6 months, but lasted only 3 weeks. Being around students, being responsible for their education and well-being, required a level of emotional stability and presence that Anya no longer had. She would stand in front of the classroom and lose track of what she was saying, would find herself staring at the students without seeing them, would have to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom when something triggered a memory. Her principal, kind but practical, suggested that maybe teaching was not the right job for her right now, that maybe she needed more time, that maybe she should consider other options. Anya quit. She moved out of her apartment, gave away most of her belongings, went to stay with her sister in Portland. She found work doing data entry from home, mindless tasks that required no creativity or emotional investment, that allowed her to earn enough to survive without having to interact with anyone. It was a smaller life than the one she had planned, a diminished life, but it was the only life she could manage. Her family worried about her, saw her withdrawing, saw her becoming a shadow of who she had been. They suggested more therapy, different medications, support groups, anything that might help. Anya tried some of these things and gave up on others, too tired to keep fighting, too defeated to believe that anything would really change. She was alive, but being alive felt like a punishment rather than a gift, a prolonged experience of pain and fear that she could not escape. The question people asked when they heard Anya's story was why she had gone to Marcus's apartment alone, why she had trusted him so quickly. The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but also with judgment, with the implication that Anya had been naive, reckless, foolish. The answer was that she had made a normal choice based on normal assumptions. Marcus had seemed safe. They had spent days together in public places. He had introduced her to his friends. Nothing in his behavior had suggested violence. The idea that she should have been more suspicious, more guarded, more afraid, was based on hindsight, on knowledge that was not available to her at the time. But the deeper question was why Marcus had done what he did, and that question had no satisfying answer. He had a history of volatile relationships, of conflicts with previous partners, but nothing that predicted the level of violence he had inflicted on Anya. Some people are simply dangerous, carry within them the capacity for harm that is invisible until it is activated by circumstances or emotions or something as random as perceived rejection. The warning signs people wanted to find in retrospect were not there, or they were so subtle as to be indistinguishable from normal human behavior. Anya's case was not unique. Violence against women while traveling is common, often underreported because victims are far from home, because language barriers make it difficult to navigate legal systems, because shame and trauma make it hard to come forward. Women are told to be careful, to avoid risky situations, to protect themselves, but the advice is often unhelpful because it defines all interactions with men as potentially risky, which makes normal life impossible. The alternative, trusting no one, going nowhere alone, living in a state of permanent vigilance, is not a solution. It is a different kind of imprisonment. What connects Anya's story to the others is the theme of trust violated. Ethan trusted that his marriage was stable. Lucia trusted that her husband would protect rather than harm her. Naomi trusted that the hospital would care for her. Noah trusted that Elise was who she claimed to be. Anya trusted that Marcus was safe. In every case, the trust was reasonable, based on evidence and experience and the normal human need to believe in the goodness of others. And in every case, that trust was weaponized, used as a tool to enable violence or neglect or exploitation. The pattern is not coincidental. It reflects something fundamental about how violence works, which is that it requires proximity, requires access, requires the victim to lower their defenses. Strangers can be violent, certainly, but most violence is committed by people who are known, who are trusted, who have been granted entry into the victim's life. The danger is not out there in the world, hidden in dark alleys and unfamiliar places. The danger is in the familiar, in the trusted, in the people and systems we rely on to keep us safe. Before we continue with the final reflections, I want to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. These stories matter, and your support helps us continue bringing them to light. Please also leave a comment about where you're listening from. It helps us understand our community. These 5 stories, different in their details but identical in their structure, point towards something uncomfortable about the world we live in. They demonstrate that safety is not a product of individual vigilance, but of collective attention, of systems that function properly, of communities that notice when something is wrong and act on that knowledge. And they demonstrate that those systems fail regularly, predictably, in ways that are tragic but also preventable. Marla Holloway was able to maintain her deception for 6 years because people accepted her explanations, because questioning her would have been uncomfortable, because it was easier to believe that Ethan had left than to consider the alternative. The failure was not individual but collective, a community-wide decision to accept a narrative that should have seemed implausible. If one person had pushed harder, had insisted on seeing evidence, had refused to let the questions fade, Ethan's body might have been discovered years earlier. But no one did, and so Marla's crime continued, and the children lived with a lie, and the truth came too late to matter for anyone except the legal system. Daniel Reyes was able to isolate and abuse Lucia because the systems designed to protect immigrants failed to account for their vulnerability, because neighbors heard and said nothing, because Lucia's lack of legal status made her afraid to seek help. The failure was structural, embedded in immigration policies that tie visa status to marriage, in cultural norms that define domestic situations as private, in the underfunding of services that might have provided her with support. If the system had been different, if neighbors had called the police the first time they heard violence, if Lucia had been able to leave without fear of deportation, she might have escaped before the violence escalated to the point of attempted murder. The hospital that forgot Naomi Keller did so because electronic systems created opportunities for error that human oversight failed to catch, because patient volume made individual attention impossible, because Naomi's isolation meant no one outside the hospital was monitoring her situation. The failure was institutional, a consequence of healthcare systems optimized for efficiency rather than care, of staffing levels that left workers overwhelmed, of the assumption that technology would prevent errors when in fact it often creates new kinds of errors. If the system had built-in redundancies, if someone had been assigned to track long-term patients, if Naomi had had family nearby to advocate for her, the error would have been caught in days rather than a year. The online network that enabled Elise Varn to target Noah Whitaker exists because digital platforms prioritize connection over verification, because lonely people are seen as a market rather than as vulnerable individuals in need of protection, because law enforcement struggles to investigate crimes that cross state lines and involve anonymous digital identities. The failure was technological and legal, a gap between the speed of innovation and the ability of regulatory systems to keep up. If dating apps required better verification, if there were more resources for investigating online fraud, if victims felt less shame about reporting these crimes, people like Elise would find it harder to operate, and people like Noah would be less likely to be targeted. Marcus's violence against Anya Volkov happened because male entitlement and possessiveness are normalized in ways that make it difficult to identify dangerous behavior until it erupts into violence. Because women traveling alone are seen as taking risks rather than simply living their lives, because the consequences for violence are often minimal and the support for victims is often inadequate. The failure was cultural, embedded in assumptions about gender and relationships and responsibility. If men were taught that rejection is not a justification for violence, if women were not blamed for the violence committed against them, if there were better support systems for victims in foreign countries, cases like Anya's would be less common. None of these failures were inevitable. All of them could have been prevented, or at least mitigated, by relatively simple changes. Better community engagement, stronger social services, more thoughtful technology design, cultural shifts in how we think about responsibility and care. The problem is not that we do not know what needs to change. The problem is that change requires sustained effort and resources and political will, and all of those things are in short supply when the people most affected by the failures are marginalized, isolated, or invisible. The people in these stories were not chosen at random. They were targeted, consciously or unconsciously, because they were vulnerable in specific ways. Ethan was vulnerable because he was trapped in a marriage he could not leave. Lucia was vulnerable because she was an immigrant with no legal status independent of her abuser. Naomi was vulnerable because she was alone and chronically ill. Noah was vulnerable because he was lonely and desperate for connection. Anya was vulnerable because she was far from home and trusting someone who seemed trustworthy. Their vulnerabilities were different, but they all shared the quality of being unseen, of existing at the margins of systems and communities, of not having enough people paying attention to notice when something went wrong. This is the pattern that repeats across all forms of violence and neglect. The victims are people whose absence or suffering does not disrupt the normal functioning of society, who can disappear or be harmed without anyone in power noticing or caring. They are people who have been taught to be quiet, to not make demands, to accept less than they deserve. They are people who trust that the systems will work, that institutions will care, that communities will notice, and who discover too late that none of those assumptions were true. The stories circulate as entertainment, as cautionary tales, as puzzles to be solved. People discuss them in online forums, debate what the victims should have done differently, analyze the psychology of the perpetrators. This serves a function, allows people to process their own fears and anxieties about violence, to reassure themselves that they would make better choices, that they would see the signs, that they would be safer. But it also obscures the real lesson, which is that safety is not primarily a matter of individual choice, but of collective responsibility. If communities noticed when people disappeared, if institutions functioned with actual care for individuals rather than bureaucratic efficiency, if technology platforms built safety into their design rather than treating it as an afterthought, if cultural norms held abusers accountable rather than victims, these stories would be rare exceptions rather than predictable patterns. The fact that they are patterns, that they happen over and over with only superficial variations, indicates that the problem is not with the individuals involved, but with the systems that allow the violence and neglect to continue. Ethan Holloway died because no one asked enough questions. Lucia Moreno nearly died because no one intervened. Naomi Keller lost a year of her life because no one noticed. Noah Whitaker was beaten and left for dead because no one had stopped the people who targeted him. Anya Volkov was strangled because no one had taught Marcus that rejection was not a justification for violence. These are not separate tragedies. They are connected by the thread of systemic failure, by the accumulated choices of thousands of people who decided, individually and collectively, that looking away was easier than looking closely, that accepting explanations was simpler than demanding truth, that someone else would handle the problem. The uncomfortable reality is that most people, when faced with the choice between comfort and action, choose comfort. It is easier to believe that domestic violence happens behind closed doors and is none of your business than to call the police when you hear screaming. It is easier to assume that someone who has disappeared just needed space than to investigate whether they are actually safe. It is easier to accept institutional assurances than to question whether those institutions are functioning properly. It is easier to blame victims for making bad choices than to examine the systems that made those choices seem reasonable or necessary. This is not a moral failing of individuals. It is a structural reality of how societies function. People are busy, overwhelmed, focused on their own problems. They do not have infinite time or energy to dedicate to other people's crises. They rely on institutions to handle the things they cannot handle themselves. And when institutions fail, the consequences are distributed in ways that are invisible to the people who are not directly affected. This is how tragedies become normal, how patterns become acceptable, how violence continues generation after generation. The question is what changes when we recognize the pattern. Does recognition lead to action, or does it simply lead to a more sophisticated form of the same indifference? The stories are told, the lessons are discussed, the recommendations are made, and then the next case happens, and the pattern repeats, because knowing what should change is different from actually changing it. There are people who dedicate their lives to trying to break these patterns. They work in underfunded nonprofits, in overwhelmed social services, in advocacy organizations that fight for policy changes that are incremental and slow. They know the statistics, know how common these failures are, know that the cases that make the news are a tiny fraction of the cases that happen. They keep working anyway, because the alternative is accepting that the pattern is inevitable, and accepting inevitability means abandoning the people who will be the next victims. These are the people who answer the hotlines when someone finally decides to call for help, who show up to court to advocate for victims who are too traumatized to advocate for themselves, who push for better training for police and healthcare workers and social service providers, who write the reports that document the failures and make recommendations that are often ignored, who create the support groups where victims can talk to other victims and realize they are not alone, not crazy, not responsible for what happened to them. Their work matters, but it is not enough, because individual effort cannot fix systemic problems. The systems have to change, and systems change slowly, if at all, because the people with the power to change them are rarely the people most affected by their failures. The people in power are insulated by wealth, by social connections, by access to resources that make them less vulnerable to the failures that destroy others. They can afford to ignore the pattern because the pattern does not threaten them. This is why these stories matter. Not because they are unusual or shocking, but because they are normal. They represent the baseline level of violence and neglect that our current systems allow, that our current culture accepts, that our current priorities perpetuate. Telling the stories does not fix the problem, but it makes the problem visible. And visibility is the first step toward change, even if it is only a first step. The people in these stories deserve better. They deserved communities that noticed when they were in danger. They deserved institutions that functioned with care rather than indifference. They deserved a culture that held abusers accountable rather than blaming victims. They deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be protected. They deserved to survive without trauma, to live without fear, to trust without being betrayed. They did not get what they deserved. That is the tragedy. But the larger tragedy is that there are thousands of others in similar situations right now. People who are isolated or trapped or manipulated or forgotten. People whose stories will unfold in predictable ways unless something changes, unless someone notices, unless the pattern is interrupted. The final question these stories raise is not what happened, but what happens next. The legal consequences have been described. Marla is in prison. Daniel is in prison. The hospital settled. Elise and her partner are in prison. Marcus is in prison. Justice, such as it is, has been served in each case. But justice is not the same as healing, and punishment is not the same as prevention. The people who were harmed by these crimes continue to carry the damage, continue to live with the consequences, continue to navigate a world that has proven itself to be less safe than they believed. Emma Holloway lives under a different name, in a different city, with a past she rarely discusses. She has built a life that is functional, even successful by external measures, but the foundation of that life is distrust. She does not form close relationships easily, does not believe people when they make promises, does not assume that anyone is who they claim to be. This serves her in some ways, protects her from certain kinds of harm, but it also isolates her, limits the depth of connection she can experience, keeps her at a distance from the life she might have had if her childhood had not been defined by her mother's crime. Nathan Holloway is an artist now, creating work that is dark and complex and deeply affecting. Critics say his pieces have a haunted quality, an exploration of absence and betrayal that feels personal even when the subject matter is abstract. They are right. Every piece is about his father, about the space where a father should have been, about the lie he lived with for 6 years, about the moment when the patio was excavated and the truth emerged. He will spend his entire life making art about this, processing it, trying to understand it, trying to transform it into something meaningful. The art is brilliant, but it is also a prison, a way of being trapped in the past, even while moving forward. Lucia Moreno still lives in the city where she relocated after the trial. She has friends now, people who know parts of her story, who understand why she flinches at loud noises, why she does not date, why she needs to know where the exits are in any room she enters. She works, pays her bills, maintains her apartment with careful attention to security. She has built a life, but it is a smaller life than the one she imagined when she first came to the United States, a life defined by survival rather than hope. She is alive, and that matters, but being alive is not the same as living. Naomi Keller did not survive long enough to build a new life, which makes her story different from the others, a reminder that not all victims get the chance to recover, that sometimes the damage is too great, that systems' failures have permanent consequences. Her death was quiet, unnoticed except by the few people who loved her, mourned by her sister, but not by the hospital that killed her through neglect, not by the broader community that had failed to notice when she disappeared into the bureaucratic void. Her story should have led to reform, but reform is slow, and most of the changes that were promised in the aftermath of her case were never implemented, which means somewhere, right now, another patient is likely experiencing a similar failure. Noah Whitaker is still learning how to trust, a process that is slow and painful and frequently interrupted by setbacks. He is in a relationship now, with someone who is patient and understanding, who knows about what happened and does not judge him for it. But the relationship is hard in ways that relationships should not be hard, because Noah cannot fully believe in it, cannot relax into it, cannot stop waiting for the betrayal that his experience has taught him is inevitable. He is working on it, in therapy, with medication, through deliberate effort, but trauma does not resolve through effort alone. It becomes part of who you are, a permanent alteration of your baseline experience of the world. Anya Volkov has not found a way to move forward. She is still living with her sister, still doing data entry, still struggling with nightmares and flashbacks, and a pervasive sense that she made a terrible mistake by surviving, that dying would have been easier than living with this level of pain. Her family watches her with helpless concern, wanting to help but not knowing how, watching her become more isolated, more withdrawn, more absent from her own life. They worry that she will eventually give up entirely, that the damage is too great, that the person she was before the attack is gone and will not return. They may be right. These are the aftermaths, the parts of the stories that do not make it into the news articles or the court transcripts. They are the long, unglamorous work of trying to survive trauma, of trying to build something resembling a normal life on a foundation that has been shattered. Some people manage better than others. Some find ways to integrate their experiences and move forward. Some remain trapped, forever circling the moment when everything changed, unable to escape its gravity. What all of them share is the knowledge that the world is not safe, that trust is dangerous, that the systems and people we rely on can fail catastrophically. This knowledge is both accurate and devastating. It is accurate because the world genuinely is not safe, systems genuinely do fail, people genuinely do betray trust. But it is devastating because living with that knowledge makes it very hard to function, to form relationships, to take risks, to hope. The people who have experienced these failures often find themselves caught between two impossibilities. They cannot trust, but they also cannot live meaningful lives without trust. There is no resolution to this dilemma, only ongoing negotiation with it. The perpetrators of these crimes are also living with consequences, though of a different kind. Marla Holloway will likely die in prison, her children estranged, her name synonymous with calculated violence. Daniel Reyes has years left on his sentence, time he will spend among other violent men, learning nothing except perhaps how to be more effectively violent. The hospital administrators who presided over Naomi's disappearance have moved on to other positions, their careers unmarred by the settlement that was paid from institutional funds rather than personal accountability. Elise Varn and her partner are in separate prisons, their scam operation shut down, but likely to be replaced by others using the same playbook. Marcus is serving his sentence in a prison in Solara Bay, far from anyone he knows, isolated in the way he isolated Anya. None of them seem to understand what they did, or if they understand, they do not care. Marla maintains that Ethan deserved what happened, that she was defending herself even though the evidence shows she was clearly the aggressor. Daniel blames Lucia for making him angry, for not being the wife he needed, for forcing him to act in ways he regrets, but that he also still believes were justified. The hospital issued statements about learning from mistakes, but admitted no real fault. Elise showed no remorse at her trial, seemed to view the victims as marks rather than people, seemed genuinely confused about why her actions were being treated as serious crimes. Marcus wrote a letter to Anya that his lawyer advised him not to send, a letter that apologized while also explaining how Anya had hurt him, how she had driven him to violence through her callousness. This lack of understanding is not unusual. Most people who cause serious harm do not see themselves as perpetrators. They have narratives that justify their actions, that reframe their violence as self-defense or justice or unfortunate necessity. These narratives are self-serving but also deeply believed, because believing them is easier than accepting responsibility, because accepting responsibility would require admitting to being a kind of person they do not want to be. The challenge for the rest of us is not understanding the perpetrators, though true crime culture often obsesses over that question. The challenge is creating systems and cultures that make it harder for them to cause harm in the first place, that catch the early signs of violence or neglect, that intervene before situations escalate to the point of irreversibility. This requires resources, attention, and a willingness to prioritize collective safety over individual convenience. It requires communities that know their members well enough to notice when someone is missing or in danger. It requires institutions that function with care rather than efficiency as their primary value. It requires technology that is designed with safety built in rather than added as an afterthought. It requires a culture that holds people accountable for harm they cause rather than finding ways to excuse or minimize it. It requires all of these things working together, because no single intervention is sufficient to break the patterns that these stories represent. Some of this is happening, slowly, in pockets. There are communities that have implemented better wellness check systems, that train residents to recognize signs of domestic violence or elder neglect, that create networks of mutual aid and support. There are hospitals that have reformed their record-keeping systems, that have added safeguards against the kind of error that trapped Naomi. There are dating platforms that have improved verification processes, that have made it easier to report suspicious behavior, that take user safety more seriously than they did a decade ago. There are countries that have strengthened protections for immigrant victims of domestic violence, that have decoupled visa status from abusive relationships. But these improvements are scattered and incomplete. For every system that gets better, there are dozens that remain unchanged, that continue to fail in predictable ways, that produce new victims who will have their own stories of betrayal and harm. The pattern continues because changing it would require a level of sustained collective effort that has proven difficult to maintain. People care intensely when a story breaks, when it is fresh and shocking and personal. But that intensity fades as other concerns take priority, and the systems revert to their baseline level of dysfunction. This is not said to discourage action, but to contextualize it, to acknowledge that the work of prevention is endless and often thankless, that the successes are quiet while the failures are dramatic, that the people doing this work need support that they rarely receive. The therapists who sit with trauma victims day after day, absorbing their pain, trying to help them find ways forward. The social workers who navigate Byzantine systems trying to get clients the help they need. The advocates who push for policy changes that take years to implement and that are often watered down or reversed. The researchers who document failures and make recommendations that are ignored. These people are fighting the pattern, and they are mostly losing, but they keep fighting because the alternative is unacceptable. The stories told here are intended to honor the victims by making their experiences visible, by refusing to let them be reduced to statistics or case numbers, by insisting that they were real people who deserved better than what they got. But honoring them is not enough. The only meaningful response to these stories is to work toward preventing the next ones, to build the systems and cultures that these victims needed and did not have, to create a world where trust is not quite so dangerous, where absence is noticed, where people who are vulnerable are actually protected rather than just told they should protect themselves. This work will not be completed in one generation, or two, or perhaps ever. But it can be advanced, incrementally, through the accumulated efforts of people who refuse to accept that the pattern is inevitable, who believe that systems can be changed even when change is slow, who understand that collective safety is built through collective effort, and that there are no individual solutions to systemic problems. The 5 stories told here represent 5 different expressions of the same fundamental failure: the failure to see, the failure to act, the failure to care. They happened in different places, to different people, but they emerged from the same conditions, the same gaps in social fabric, the same structural indifference to suffering that does not affect people in power. Understanding this is important because it shifts the focus from individual perpetrators to the systems that enable them. From asking, "How could this person do such a thing?" to asking, "How did our collective choices make it possible for this thing to happen?" Ethan Holloway was buried in his own backyard, and for 6 years no one questioned his absence strongly enough to discover the truth. This was not because Marla was exceptionally clever, though she was competent in her deception. It was because the community had normalized his absence, had accepted explanations that should have seemed inadequate, had decided collectively that a missing man was not their problem. The failure was communal, distributed across dozens of people who could have asked harder questions but chose not to, who prioritized their own comfort over their neighbor's safety. When we ask why no one noticed, the honest answer is that people did notice. They noticed that Ethan's absence seemed strange. They noticed that Marla's explanations did not quite add up. They noticed the text messages seemed unlike him. But noticing is different from acting, and action requires believing that you have both the right and the responsibility to intervene in someone else's situation. Most people do not believe this. They have been socialized to respect privacy, to avoid making accusations without proof, to mind their own business. These are not bad principles in general, but they become dangerous when they prevent intervention in cases of serious harm. The balance between privacy and intervention is genuinely difficult. No one wants to live in a community where neighbors constantly surveil and report each other, where every deviation from normal behavior triggers an investigation. But we also cannot accept a situation where people can be murdered and buried and forgotten because everyone respected the murderer's privacy too much to question them. Finding the right balance requires wisdom and judgment and cultural norms that currently do not exist in most communities. Lucia Moreno's abuse continued for 2 years in a house where neighbors occasionally heard sounds of violence. They heard, but they did not call the police, did not knock on the door, did not do anything except perhaps mention it to each other in conversations that went nowhere. When asked why they did not intervene, they gave the standard reasons. They were not sure what they were hearing, they did not want to intrude, they thought maybe it was not their business, they assumed if it were serious someone else would handle it. This is the bystander effect writ large, the psychological phenomenon where the presence of other potential helpers makes each individual less likely to help because they assume someone else will. It operates at the community level, creating situations where everyone is aware of a problem, but no one takes responsibility for addressing it. Breaking this pattern requires explicit cultural, and sometimes legal changes that make intervention not just permissible but expected, that protect people who report concerns even if those concerns turn out to be unfounded, that create clear pathways for action rather than leaving individuals to figure out what to do on their own. Some jurisdictions have implemented mandatory reporting requirements for certain kinds of suspected abuse, particularly involving children or elders. These laws have their own problems, can lead to over-reporting and false accusations and traumatic investigations of innocent families. But they also save lives by creating a legal obligation that overrides the cultural pressure to mind your own business. The challenge is implementing such systems in ways that balance intervention with rights, that protect vulnerable people without creating new forms of harm. Naomi Keller's disappearance into the hospital system was enabled by the complexity and impersonality of modern institutional care. The electronic medical records that were supposed to improve coordination actually created a new vulnerability by allowing a clerical error to persist uncaught. The high patient volume meant that no individual staff member had a complete picture of who was in the hospital and why. The assumption that the system would flag problems meant that people did not look for problems manually, trusting technology to do work that technology cannot actually do. This pattern repeats across all kinds of large institutions. Schools lose track of students. Social services lose track of clients. Criminal justice systems lose track of offenders and victims. The larger and more complex the institution, the easier it becomes for individuals to fall through cracks, to become invisible, to be forgotten. The solution is not to avoid complexity. Large societies require complex institutions, but to build in redundancies, human checks on automated systems, regular audits that verify that the database matches reality. This costs money and requires staffing levels that most institutions consider unaffordable. There is constant pressure to do more with less, to automate processes, to increase Anya Volkov's assault happened in a cultural context where male violence against women is common enough to be unremarkable, where women are routinely told to protect themselves rather than men being told not to be violent, where the response to a woman being attacked is often to question her choices rather than to hold the attacker accountable. This is not specific to Solara Bay or to any particular culture. It is a global pattern, expressed differently in different places, but fundamentally similar everywhere. The cultural changes needed to address this are profound and slow. They require rethinking masculinity, teaching boys different models of how to handle rejection and conflict, creating consequences for abusive behavior that actually deter future abuse rather than minimally inconveniencing the abuser. They require believing women when they report violence, supporting them through the aftermath, creating systems that protect them rather than re-traumatizing them through the process of seeking justice. Some progress has been made. There is more awareness now than there was a generation ago about domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, harassment. There are more resources for victims, more training for police and prosecutors, more cultural conversation about consent and coercion. But progress is uneven and fragile, can be reversed by backlash, requires constant effort to maintain and extend. What connects all of these cases is that they could have been prevented, or at least mitigated, by relatively straightforward interventions. A community that followed up on a missing person more persistently. A neighbor who called the police when they heard violence. A hospital that had better systems for tracking patients. A dating platform that invested more in safety features. A culture that took male violence against women more seriously. None of these interventions is radical or impossible. All of them are within reach of current social and technological capabilities. The fact that they do not happen consistently is not because we lack the knowledge or tools, but because we lack the will, the resources, and the sustained collective commitment to prioritize preventing harm over other values like privacy, efficiency, profit, and convenience. This is the uncomfortable truth that these stories point toward. The pattern of violence and neglect continues not because it is inevitable, but because we have collectively decided, through our choices about how to allocate resources and structure systems and respond to harm, that preventing it is not a high enough priority. We have decided this not through explicit decisions, but through the accumulation of small choices, budget allocations, policy compromises, and cultural norms that add up to a system that allows predictable harms to continue. Changing this would require different choices. It would require investing more in social services, in community mental health, in domestic violence prevention programs. It would require reforming institutions to prioritize care over efficiency. It would require regulating technology platforms to make safety a mandatory rather than optional feature. It would require cultural shifts in how we think about responsibility and intervention and collective care. It would require treating prevention as a public good worth paying for rather than as an optional expense that can be cut when budgets are tight. These changes will not happen automatically. They require advocacy, organizing, political pressure, sustained effort from people who care about these issues even when they are not personally affected by them. They require building coalitions across different kinds of harm and different vulnerable populations, recognizing that the same systemic failures that enable domestic violence also enable elder abuse, child neglect, exploitation of immigrants, and institutional failures like the one that trapped Naomi. The work is difficult and often thankless. The victories are small and easily reversed. The opposition is powerful and well-funded. But the alternative is accepting that stories like these will continue to happen, that people will continue to fall through the cracks, that the pattern will repeat endlessly with only the names and locations changing. That acceptance is intolerable for anyone who believes that collective life should involve actual care for each other, that society should be organized around human flourishing rather than around the convenience of the powerful. These stories end here, but the pattern they represent does not. Somewhere right now, someone is being isolated by an abusive partner. Someone is disappearing into a bureaucratic system that has lost track of them. Someone is being manipulated by a person they met online. Someone is trusting someone who will betray that trust violently. The specific details will be different, the names will be different, but the structure will be the same, because the systems that enable these harms have not changed. The question is but their stories, shared with permission and respect, can serve a function beyond their individual experiences. They can make visible patterns that are usually invisible, can demonstrate connections between seemingly separate issues, can challenge assumptions about who is vulnerable and how harm happens and what responsibility looks like. They can create space for conversations that are uncomfortable but necessary, conversations about what we owe each other, about how to structure society around care rather than indifference, about the gap between the values we claim to hold and the reality of how we actually treat vulnerable people. These conversations are happening in academic settings and policy discussions and community organizing. There are people working on better models for community safety that do not rely entirely on policing. There are reforms to healthcare systems trying to prevent cases like Naomi's. There are improvements to technology platforms making them slightly safer. There are cultural shifts in how we talk about domestic violence and victim responsibility. None of these efforts is sufficient on its own, but together they represent a recognition that the current situation is unacceptable and that change, however slow, is necessary. The challenge is maintaining momentum when the specific stories that generated attention fade from public consciousness. People care intensely about a case when it is in the news, when there is a trial or a verdict or a settlement. But that attention span is short, and once the case is no longer new, people move on to other concerns, and the systemic issues that produce the case remain unaddressed. This is why the work cannot rely on outrage or on reactions to individual cases. It has to be sustained by people and organizations committed to long-term change, who understand that preventing the next case requires building different systems and cultures, not just punishing the perpetrators of the last case. It requires funding that is stable rather than reactive, policies that are comprehensive rather than piecemeal, cultural norms that are deeply embedded rather than superficially adopted in response to crisis. The stories of Ethan, Lucia, Naomi, Noah, and Anya are offered here not as entertainment or as puzzles to be solved, but as evidence of systemic failure and as a call to do better. They are reminders that safety is collective rather than individual, that the systems we build and the cultures we maintain have real consequences for real people, that looking away is a choice that enables harm. If you have listened to these stories all the way through, you have done the work of paying attention, of sitting with discomfort, of not looking away even when the content is difficult. That attention is valuable, but it is only the first step. The next step is considering what these stories mean for how you move through the world, for what you notice and what you do when you notice, for how you think about your responsibilities to people who are not you. It might mean being the person who asks questions when someone disappears, who does not accept easy explanations when something seems wrong. It might mean calling the police when you hear violence rather than assuming someone else will handle it. It might mean advocating for better funding for social services or supporting organizations that do prevention work. It might mean challenging cultural norms that blame victims or excuse perpetrators. It might mean something as simple as checking in on people who seem isolated, offering help even when it is not asked for, being willing to be inconvenienced in order to potentially prevent harm. None of these actions guarantees that harm will be prevented. You might intervene and be wrong, might make someone uncomfortable with your questions, might waste resources on a concern that turns out to be unfounded. But the cost of occasional false alarms is much lower than the cost of consistent failure to notice real problems. The errors we should fear are not the errors of caring too much, of asking too many questions, of taking threats too seriously. The errors we should fear are the errors of indifference, of assuming someone else is paying attention, of accepting explanations that should be questioned. Before we close, I want to thank you for listening to these stories all the way through. If this content has been meaningful to you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from and what these stories have made you think about, and share this with others who might benefit from hearing it. These stories matter, and your engagement helps ensure they reach people who need to hear them. The pattern will continue until we collectively decide it should not. That decision requires more than individual choices. It requires systemic change, cultural transformation, sustained political and social commitment to building a world where people are actually seen and protected and valued. But individual choices matter too, because systems are made of people, and cultures are made of accumulated individual actions. And change begins with someone deciding that the current situation is unacceptable and that they will do something, however small, to challenge it. These 5 stories have ended, but the larger story continues. What happens next depends on what we do with the knowledge they provide, whether we allow it to change how we think and act, or whether we file it away as interesting content and move on to the next thing. The choice is ours, individually and collectively, and the people who will be the subjects of future stories, either as survivors or as victims, are counting on us to choose differently than the people in these stories did. Most harm is not loud. It waits to be ignored. It builds in silence, in the spaces between what people notice and what they act on, in the gap between what should happen and what actually happens. It continues because we allow it to continue, because we have structured our world in ways that enable it, because we have convinced ourselves that someone else will handle it, or that it is not really our problem, or that we cannot know for sure and therefore should do nothing. But we can know. We can notice. We can act. We can build different systems, maintain different cultures, make different choices. We can decide that the pattern is not inevitable, that these stories do not have to keep happening, that prevention is possible if we are willing to do the work. The question is whether we will. The people in these stories deserve communities that noticed when they were in danger, institutions that functioned with care, cultures that protected rather than blamed them. They did not get what they deserved, and now they cannot be helped. But there are others, countless others, who are in similar situations right now, who might still be helped if we choose to see them, to act, to care. That choice is available to all of us, every day, in small moments that might mean nothing or might mean everything. The difference between a tragedy and a near miss is often just one person deciding to pay attention, to ask a question, to take a concern seriously. It is not glamorous work. It is not dramatic. But it is the work that actually prevents harm, that actually creates safety, that actually demonstrates that we value each other's lives. These stories end here, with the weight of what was lost and what continues to be lost, with the knowledge that the pattern persists, with the hope that something might change. What happens next is up to us. Thank you for listening. Please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and pay attention to the silences. They are where the truth lives, waiting to be noticed.